Okay, everybody. This is Guillermo Escobar Vásquez. I am here with a very, very special guest, the one and only Caleb Maupin. Um, and I also have Marcus Cicero as well. And we should be having Noel or OG de Rancho. And I believe Angelo should be joining us as well. Caleb, I've been listening to your content for a long time. I think that you do a very good job compared to most YouTubers and sort of kind of like explaining to them and, you know, sort of like more simpler, but at least initially, but more later on, more complex terms of like how like socialism like actually operates, not just in theory, but also in practice as well. I think you do a great job in informing a lot of people who want to know about this sort of stuff. I just kind of, if you could you give my audience here, who's primarily Hispanic, a sort of like brief overview of kind of like, how you started out in politics, what it is that you kind of push for and how you basically got here, Caleb?
Well, I got interested in Marxism and communism when I was young, growing up in Ohio in a small town. When I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, I got involved with activism around police brutality and anti-imperialism and various issues. During the Occupy Wall Street protests, at that point, I was already living in New York, and I was one of the primary Marxist or communist voices within the Occupy movement. I started appearing on international media. I ended up working with Press TV, the TV network from Iran, as well as RT, and I'm now a reporter for RT, the TV network from Russia. I've traveled to Venezuela, to Ecuador, to Brazil, as well as to Iran a number of times and to Russia a number of times. I'm an anti-imperialist. I come from the Marxist-Leninist tradition, but I'm also a little more modern. I think that, I would describe myself as a 21st century socialist and an anti-imperialist. And I think that we need to figure out a model for developing socialism in the United States that could actually get to the broad masses of people and actually win. And I feel like the left is a little bit too isolated. But anti-imperialism and opposing the global system of monopoly capitalism is primary. Building a society where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve the people and not just the profits of a few should be the goal. So that's where I'm coming from.
Awesome. Yeah. I was just curious, Caleb. You said you got your, or a lot of how like you're sort of known, at least initially, was from, Occupy Wall Street. A lot of people were making a name for themselves back then. If I may ask, what do you think were the biggest problems that occurred during Occupy Wall Street that sort of started fragmenting and dividing up the left?
Well, during Occupy Wall Street, you have to remember Occupy Wall Street was really like take three. Okay. So Obama had gotten elected, and it was like, the Bush administration had been kind of a dismal failure, and the religious right had alienated a lot of Muslims around the world. And so, the economy had crashed and Obama was in office. And there was a feeling among, like, I would say, like the wealthier capitalists that some level of like social democracy and stabilization of the country was probably needed in order to like hold the country together in the aftermath of the Bush years and the financial crisis. And in order to do that, they had this problem called the Tea Party. The Tea Party just fought Obama at every turn, and the Republicans were very good at mobilizing their base. And so the Democrats kind of realized that they needed to have some kind of left wing voice that could kind of push back against the Tea Party. And, that the labor unions had a national demonstration called the One Nation March or whatever. It was a disaster. It was the lamest rally I've ever been to. They had Jon Stewart, and The Daily Show and Stephen Colbert had this rally in Washington, D.C. called the Rally to Restore Sanity. And it was also just a complete flop. There were some, they made a movie, Capitalism, a Love Story by Michael Moore, came out. It was in the theaters. There was some attempts to build some protests that the unions and some others were involved with. And Occupy Wall Street was after there had been a series of failures. Occupy Wall Street was an attempt by the establishment to like get a left-wing opposition to the Tea Party that actually had some energy to it. And it actually caught on, unlike all these other like false starts that had just flopped, whether it was the unions or Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert or whatever. So Occupy Wall Street had some energy to it. It had a message that was very catchy. We are the 99%. Wall Street and the big banks are something that everyone can be mad at, whether you're a libertarian or a liberal or a socialist or an anarchist or whatever you are. And it caught on. The thing was that there were a lot of operatives, people being paid by NGOs and foundations that were there to make sure Occupy Wall Street didn't turn into anything that would be a real threat to the system. One of the ways they did that is they made sure it had no demands. They emphasized this: no demands. We can't have any demands. No demands. No demands. No demands. So it was not a march for something. It was just a march against something. And that something was Wall Street. And Wall Street is just what? It's, the financial district of New York City. It was very, very hard to define. We all knew what we were against, but we didn't even really know exactly why we were against it. There were a series of other grievances, and we didn't really know what we were for. And I saw Occupy Wall Street basically as a great place to meet people. It was an opportunity to meet people and engage with them about socialism and communism. That's about it. It was a great place to meet people who were open to hearing a revolutionary message. It was a great place to meet people. But other than that, it was just kind of liberals creating a buzz in the street to push back against the Republicans. And that's really all it was. And this is what happens when you enter a capitalist crisis. Different sections of the ruling class mobilize their foot soldiers to push back against the other section. This is a whole process that Karl Marx called Bonapartism, where when the capitalist economy is very unstable, one section of the capitalist class will try to take control of the government and use the government to resolve the crisis at the expense of the other capitalists. Every capitalist wants the economy to get better. They all just want the other capitalists to be the ones who pay for it. And this is what happens. And so this was a Bonapartist struggle. The Tea Party had been kicking around Obama, so Obama had Occupy Wall Street, and then after that, Black Lives Matter, kick around the Republicans, and it's this push-pull, and it's kind of defining politics in our time.
Yeah, that's very well put. Marcus, do you have any comments on what Caleb was talking about before we introduced Noel onto the show?
Sure, just like one brief thing. So Caleb, love your work. I've listened to you a lot over the years. Would you say that these operatives that you talked about, they started pushing more id-pol ideas, more niche ideas to really break apart worker solidarity? Any kind of working class struggle becomes just divided up into just various segments, usually at each other's throats. Some people talk about Black Lives Matter as being the same way. It just automatically alienates an entire part of the working class that becomes more prone to reactionary ideology. Like you see, like Trump played on it. The Republicans are playing on it right now. And it's just this like back and forth tug of war.
Well, I mean, that definitely happens in many, many parts of the left wing. During Occupy Wall Street, there was some of that, but not much. There was some of it. There was a whole lot of anger. At one point, there was this very, very big angry demand that it was called Occupy. And people claimed the term Occupy was racist because imperialists occupy people's countries. And so there was this demand that Occupy be called Decolonize Wall Street rather than Occupy Wall Street. And there were some very heated, screaming meetings that I had to sit through and listen to people that were very angry about that. There were some other things. There were people that were angry that there were economic demands, that people were having signs about jobs and stuff. And I don't know, there was some of that. Occupy Wall Street was majority white, I would say. And there was some id-pol. I would say that, however, the main way that Occupy Wall Street was derailed was it was derailed by making sure it never put forward a policy. It never demanded anything whatsoever. It was just, we are the 99% all day, all week, Occupy Wall Street. That was it. It wasn't for it was just this big gathering. And I must say that, when it started, it was a lot of people that saw it as political. But after a while, it just kind of became a gathering for homeless people and a gathering for, there's a certain element, you talk about the lumpen proletariat, people that like ride railroads around and, like some of these kind of hippie religious kind of people. And I would say, by the time Occupy Wall Street had been, going for about a month, about half of that park were not political folks. They were there, doing drugs. They were there dancing around. They were there, I don't know, getting free food from people. It was just kind of a general gathering of hippies for a lot of people. You know, it was kind of Woodstock in the middle of Manhattan or something, you know, and then there was a good half of the people that were pretty political. And then among those people that were pretty political, it was very divided. I mean, there was a big anarcho-capitalist current at Occupy Wall Street. You know, people don't talk about that. There was a big libertarian anarcho-capitalist thing. There was a lot of ideological anarchism was pushed really hard. These anarchists must have had a lot of funding behind them because there were so many of these glossy anarchist magazines being handed out. You know, I was there trying to represent the Workers' World Party. There were some Trotskyites that were there and such. There were a lot of just like Rachel Maddow kind of liberals who were there.
Of course.
Democratic Party kind of, you know, DNC people, like, you know, like I think, you know, like Howard Dean or somebody, like boxes and boxes of like books written by Howard Dean would just be dumped in the park every day. And it's like, you know, no one wanted these books. A lot of them ended up in the garbage, you know. It was just, you know, it was, and there were a lot of like people who came to Occupy Wall Street who'd heard about it on MSNBC or Rachel Maddow and would show up and, you know, were just kind of the kind of people that would just vote for Democrats, but they liked it because it was changing the conversation or something like that. So there was some of that. One thing that was particularly disturbing was the color revolution current really showed up. Every one of these color revolution, you know, people that are trying to overthrow the government of Iran, they showed up and said,
Caleb, real quickly for my audience, just so they understand, can you give them a brief summary of like what color revolutions are and like what the main purpose is about them before you continue?
Sure. I mean, you know, this is the way the United States government and the CIA destabilize countries is they stage uprisings against anti-imperialist governments around the world that you know, destabilize the country and create an opportunity for the government to be overthrown. And you know, the term color revolution became popularized during the fall of the Soviet Union, because in every single one of the countries of the Eastern Bloc, you know, there would be some big protests that would get a lot of media attention. And that would create some instability, and then a pro-U.S. faction of the military would just come in and overthrow the government. And that was how you overthrew socialism in the Eastern Bloc. And you know, I mean, Ukraine, I think they had an Orange Revolution. You know, they had the Euromaidan. You know, and since then, you know, the movements funded by the U.S. State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy to overthrow various governments around the world, they are generally referred to as color revolutions because they're vague. You know, they're against corruption. You know, in Iran, for example, a group that's trying to protest and overthrow the Iranian government. They call it the Green Revolution. What are they for? Well, they're green. You know, I mean, it's this vague thing that anyone who's got any grievance can just kind of project their narrative onto, show up, create some instability, and then that lays the basis for maneuvering behind the scenes. Libya was overthrown with what you could call a color revolution. You know, you can look at Syria and how the Syrian civil war started. You know, these are what you can call color revolutions. It's a tactic for staging a coup, making it look like a popular uprising.
Awesome. Yeah. Great stuff. And Rancho, there's a lot of new people from Caleb's audience listening tonight. I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself, kind of say what you're about, and then kind of talk about generally the Sandinista movement a little bit, if you could, please.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Noel OG del Rancho. I have a YouTube channel that's kind of focused more on, I guess, what's being called kind of like the Hispanista or Hispanismo movement, which clearly is kind of tied into some famous Marxist figures like Castro and Che Guevara, who, you know, I'm sure we'll expand the conversation in that direction a little bit later. But yeah, I'm Nicaraguan. Have lived in Nicaragua for a third of my life. I've been in the United States. I'm 32 years old now, so you guys can do the math. So, you know, my family's kind of were on both sides of the conflict down there when the Sandinista thing broke out. But I do have family that, you know, literally fought in the war and are still in the military structure in Nicaragua. So we're very familiar. I'm very, you know, I kind of grew up around that history. Because my family was kind of split, you know, it's kind of a dispassionate matter to me. I'm not necessarily like a hardcore Sandinista or anti-Sandinista, but I do recognize and respect what ultimately they've been able to accomplish. And that's how I actually became familiar with some of Caleb's work, because he's highlighted it a lot on his channel. And, you know, speaking of the color revolutions, that's something that happened in Nicaragua in 18. And I was in the country around that time. So I saw the writing on the wall. I saw it coming. I saw the kind of covert efforts that, you know, the three-letter agencies employ down there. Oddly enough, it was happening a lot through evangelical missionaries, social media, Instagram type of kids. So I saw it coming. You asked me a specific question. Did you want me to expand on something specifically?
No, I think that's a pretty good intro. I
Cool.
was just, yeah, I thought it would just be a good thing, kind of like just for, Caleb's audience and for your audience to kind of start to get to know each other a little bit. I thought it would be a good introduction.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's like from our perspective, we've been fighting like, the Yankee Devil for, a long time now. And during I guess my parents' generation, that struggle took a Cold War dynamic to it, and so it was like the rapacious capitalist world was coming to Latin America to, keep our people down, oppress us, take our resources, just kind of sow inequality, disharmony amongst society. And so it made sense why these movements that were trying to oust these, corrupt dictators that place their personal interests above the country's eventually took on a Marxist lexicon, to say, or kind of a spirit of branding, because again, they positioned themselves against this type of worldview. So yeah.
Awesome. So I have a question here now that we've tied that kind of like all in. Let me pull it up here because I have it saved. So yeah, this is kind of for you, Caleb, which I think would be good to understand. So as you guys probably know, I've gone over this a lot. I've done like an 8-hour series on Che Guevara on my YouTube channel. I've done even more with Marcus on Fidel Castro himself. But just so everybody understands, the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, these were both kind of like big tent revolutions that united people, from, I guess, in these Latin American societies, traditionally from the right and the left. But ultimately, they had leaders who went on to openly embrace Marxist-Leninism for, slightly differing reasons once they had finally achieved power. Because Fidel Castro was not, he did not want to go out and tell, and it's possible he wasn't even a Marxist-Leninist until he actually, he had to make the conscious decision after getting power. I'm not going to speculate. All I do know is that Raul Castro and Che Guevara were definitely Marxist the whole time. Castro was kind of like, he had like an inner kind of like debate on what to embrace. My point is, Caleb, is what do you think like about this sort of stuff? Like, do you favor big tent movements where socialist factions should fight for power after the revolution? Or do you think like big tent movements are just a lot of trouble and that people in this day and age should avoid? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Well, if you look at every socialist revolution that has ever happened, it has been like a coalition. The communists sit at the center of what's called the United Front, which is a broad mobilization of society around some key demands, right? I mean, the Russian Revolution, it was peace, land, and bread. In China, it was, defeating the Japanese invaders, redistributing land, and if you look at the Bolivarian coalitions that have emerged, if you look at the Cuban Revolution, if you look at the Nicaraguan Revolution, it was clear that yes, there was an ideological Marxist-Leninist current, but in order to take power, they had to mobilize a lot more people than that, right? And that it's that kind of polarization of society where, a question emerges in the country. A lot of the Bolivarian countries, the initial election of Hugo Chavez or the initial election of Evo Morales was, are you for neoliberalism and the cuts, or are you against it? And there might have been a lot of people that maybe they weren't socialists or communists, but they could oppose neoliberalism. When the Bolsheviks took power, the really burning issue was, are you for continuing World War I or not? The Bolsheviks were the biggest, strongest anti-war force, and all the other political parties, even the other Marxists, wanted to continue fighting in World War I. And that generally is how the road towards socialism is achieved, is through building a coalition, a united front. And there are different strategies about how to do this. This is one of the whole points of there's the united front from below, the popular front. There are different ways of doing this, but it's clear that most people are not capable, at least under this society, of becoming ideological Marxists, right? That in order to take power, communists have to find a way to activate and mobilize people who may not agree with their entire program.
Awesome, great answer. And yeah, I think I'm not trying to be too rough towards your camp, but I think you do unfortunately have a lot of people in your camp in America, at least, who believe that they need to, like, exclude anyone. It isn't completely 100% on the exact same, ideology, and it just splinters, and you see it just, never, you see these movements never take off the ground. And that's kind of my biggest critique. I like what you're doing, though. I think it's a lot more sober. It's much more based on reality. It's much more just something that would make a lot more sense for just Americans and people, the proletariat across the world in general. So I want to ask you this, just for my audience, because a lot of them just, they don't understand the fullest context of this. Can you give some specific egregious examples of actions that the CIA have taken to mess with Latin American countries that have attempted to break free from the United States empire?
Well, I mean, the most blatant example, the most well-known example, I think, is Nicaragua, and how the Contras, this group of drug-dealing terrorists, were armed and trained by the U.S. government and given weapons and sent to Nicaragua to wage an ugly civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And then even when the U.S. Congress passed a law against it because they were massacring priests and nuns and slaughtering whole villages and burning healthcare clinics, that Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration sold missiles to Iran in order to continue, funneling money to the Contras. But you can talk about, many people talk about Pinochet, the military dictator of Chile, who overthrew Salvador Allende, the elected leader. But almost every Latin American country has had a military junta, a military dictatorship backed up by the United States at one point. Right, Venezuela, Argentina. I mean, many countries have had coups, overthrow elected governments, and bring in brutal military juntas that have brutally suppressed their populations. Before Nicaragua had its revolution, it had Somoza, who was a brutal dictator who was backed by the United States when he tortured people and murdered people. And I mean, the USA claims it supports democracy, but all over South and Central America, the USA has aligned itself with some of the most brutal, authoritarian, Bonapartist military states in the hopes of preventing communist revolution.
Yeah, great answer once again. Noel, you got anything to add to that on the topic of Nicaragua and the Contras?
Sure. I was going to add Noriega as another example, but what's interesting is that even with these military dictatorships in Latin America, they're also very disposable. It's like even those allegiances aren't necessarily deep or ideological. It's just a matter of convenience, like we saw with Saddam, right, when he was fighting Iran. And even Osama bin Laden, right? So, the U.S. is not a sincere friend to anyone. I did want to bring up Operation Condor, if you're familiar with that, Caleb, if you wanted to expand a little bit about that.
Why don't you go ahead?
No, I'm honestly not that familiar. Someone in the audience brought it up. I know it had something to do with kind of anti-communist operations, but I figured you might know more about
I'm actually, off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what it is. So
that's fine. It's not a big deal. I was going to ask you this while we're on this topic. Also, I could be wrong, Caleb, but on the topic of funding the Contras under Reagan and the CIA, is it actually true? I just want the audience to understand, is it actually true that the Reagan administration was selling, stuff like crack cocaine in all of these inner city neighborhoods, particularly black clients, in order to raise money for this? What's the truth behind this?
Okay, well, that's what you said there is a little bit of a crude exaggeration. Okay,
I figured.
What it was is the Contras, which were the terrorist group that was fighting the government of Nicaragua.
Gotcha.
They were receiving CIA support. They were provided with airplanes. They were provided with weapons, and they were the ones that were selling crack cocaine all over the United States. And this is a very interesting aspect of how the CIA tends to work, because the CIA, it became illegal for the U.S. government to directly fund these folks. So there are ways of helping people do things, and one way of helping assets do things is you arrange for them to be involved in the drug trade. For example, they did this with with Osama bin Laden when he was working with the United States in Afghanistan. Not only did they give him guns and weapons, but they also arranged for him to sell heroin, in Afghanistan, to set up poppy fields, right? And that was in addition to the funds and weapons the Contras were getting, allowing them to smuggle drugs into the United States and not get arrested, was a way that they could be subsidized. Gary Webb, the journalist, is the one who exposed most blatantly the CIA's connection with the crack cocaine epidemic and the fact that the Contras, who were supported by the United States, were involved in the drug trade. What's also interesting is that in Colombia, you know, we all know of Colombia as the big cocaine country, right?
Yeah, my parents fled Pablo Escobar. That's why I'm here.
Wow. Yeah. You know, you know, the USA was also backing these paramilitaries in Colombia to fight the FARC.
Right.
And those paramilitaries, even though the official reason we were supposedly arming the paramilitaries was because the FARC were drug dealers, supposedly, turns out these paramilitaries were working with the Contras. And part of the way the Contras got the cocaine that they ended up smuggling was getting it from people in Colombia. So in both Colombia and in Nicaragua, the USA was giving guns and weapons and, you know, arranging for people they knew to be selling drugs to bring drugs in and out of the United States. So, you know, it wasn't like U.S. government. It wasn't like CIA guys were out on the street with drugs. You know, it was it's you know, some people got, you know, a wink and a nod permission and, you know, weapons and such, and they were involved in it.
That makes a lot more sense. So it's like basically they're using weaponized like paramilitary cartelish groups in order to do this. I had like this weird idea in my head that like CIA agents were like going to like these ghettos and like selling crack. So I'm glad you cleared that up for me because that actually makes a lot more sense.
What's interesting though is in the 60s, something called MK Ultra happened, and that was actually CIA guys going around giving people LSD. That happened. So
that's interesting. Why were they giving people LSD in order to just test the effects on what it would do to people as a way to kind of like try to get an upper hand on the Soviet Union for like, you know, interrogation techniques?
That was part of it from what I understand. They also wanted to see what the effect was if a whole bunch of people got high. Apparently they had something called Operation Midnight Climax, where in the Bay Area, they just had guys walk around and put LSD in a bunch of people's drinks and restaurants and stuff, and then sit back and take notes about what happened as people started freaking out. The other thing was that there were a lot of open air rock concerts in the day where there were people that were there giving LSD away to people.
The CIA was intentionally trying to promote the counterculture.
Yes.
What was the name of the doctor who was famous? He was like the, you know,
Dr. Timothy Leary. And Dr.
Leary, he worked for the CIA.
Well, he had been a Harvard professor, and at Harvard, the CIA had set up some LSD experiments on students, and that's how he had first taken LSD, was with this research that the CIA was sponsoring at Harvard. He really liked LSD, and suddenly he was on television. He was traveling all over the country with a big budget. He actually had a building in Manhattan, a whole building that said League for Spiritual Discovery, LSD, on the doors, and it was known you could just go there and get LSD. And it was this guy, Dr. Timothy Leary, who was, was just going around the United States promoting and distributing LSD to people. Now, eventually, when Nixon came into office, Nixon arrested him, and so he was broken out of jail by the Weather Underground, and he fled the USA, and eventually he was apprehended in Afghanistan, taken back to the USA, did some time in prison. And after he got out of prison, he was an FBI informant for the rest of his life. And he traveled around, still giving speeches about how great LSD was, but he had FBI agent handlers who he would consult with, and he would actually pass the names of other drug users on to. So, yeah, he was completely compromised, Dr. Timothy Leary, but he was the drug guru of the 1960s, and he had CIA written all over him. He was definitely a product of MK Ultra.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, and we're not going to delve into this too far, but I figured since we're sort of on this topic, I've noticed that I've heard a lot of people put out this hypothesis that a lot of stuff like the the Frankfurt School ideas of critical theory, things against like the authoritarian personality, for example, that these were things also that the CIA sort of promoted in Western academia at the time as a way to try and counter the sort of like Stalinist left that was originating in the United States, that was a lot more organic and popular with the proletariat of the United States, and that they wanted to sort of like lead it as more of, they wanted to like co-opt this and turn it more into like a sort of Trotskyite-ish sort of like hippie movement. What is the truth about this, and like how would you break this down?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a matter of public record now. I mean, a lot has been written about the Cultural Cold War. You can read Joel Whitney wrote a book called Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Greatest Writers. There's a book called The Cultural Cold War. There's a number of books on this topic. I mean, it's public record. The CIA's own website brags about this. But, Yeah, starting in 1949, the CIA launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And that was a way to subsidize intellectuals, scientists, writers, academics, political activists who were anti-Soviet. They gave the main group of people that they had staff the Congress for Cultural Freedom were Shachtmanite Trotskyists. Actually, the founder of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was Irving Kristol, who was a follower of Max Shachtman. He was a Trotskyite. But he also later went on to become the father of neoconservatism. And that's kind of the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline goes through the CIA.
Was David Horowitz involved in this? Just curious.
No, David Horowitz was the editor of Ramparts magazine, which was kind of a liberal hippie magazine in San Francisco that all of a sudden just kind of went out of business. And then he disappeared for about a decade. No one heard anything from him. And then he resurfaced in the 80s as a neocon. But he's a lot younger than most of these guys. Most of these guys who were the neocon Trotskyites who became the CIA, fake left, if you want to call it that. Most of those guys, Irving Howe is a big name, and Hannah Arendt associated with these people, Susan Sontag. Most of them had been, they had been New York City kind of college professor types in the 1930s. And they didn't like the Soviet Union. So they went to the Trotskyites. It was a way to be a socialist, but be anti-Soviet. And then when the Cold War got going after the Second World War, it became clear to them that they were on the side of U.S. imperialism in the Cold War. And so based on that, they didn't have any qualms working with the CIA. And that's, a magazine was created called Partisan Review. And that magazine was everywhere. It was this socialist magazine that was on every college campus. You could get copies of it. It was just widely available, and it was paid for by the CIA. And in Germany, they created a similar publication called Der Monat. And Der Monat, it paid people who were part of the Frankfurt School for articles, basically. It was a way to funnel money to the Frankfurt School and popularize the Frankfurt School. Herbert Marcuse, who had worked at the U.S. State Department before he became a Marxist academic, a number of other figures that were associated with the Frankfurt School were published and promoted by Der Monat. There was also the Paris Review, which was out of Paris, and that's what made James Baldwin, famous as an anti-communist civil rights activist. There was a publication in London that was paid for by the CIA called Encounter. And it was just a way to subsidize and highlight the work of anti-communist but left-wing intellectuals. And they would go after quote unquote Stalinists. They would hit pieces on Stalinists, like Lillian Hellman, for example, and others trying to expose them or whatever. And then they would also write articles that were like edgy criticism of US culture and media. And if you read Partisan Review magazine, that's really what it was. And Adorno comes out of there, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt. And basically, a lot of these intellectuals that you read in college, whenever you go to college, if you read like left-wing stuff, it's going to be a CIA-linked person, most likely.
Of course. I'm going to ask you two questions here, and I'm going to put it in the private chat just so you can read it in case you lose track. I know it can be hard when you're live streaming sometimes. Okay. And then after you answer those two questions, I'll let Marcus comment or ask any questions to build upon that. But I want you to explain, because I've noticed it's like a meme in a lot of right-wing circles, like this term cultural Marxism. And that's kind of like what you've been describing here. I personally think cultural capitalism is a much better way to describe that phenomenon. But how did this term come up? And then can you explain for the audience the difference, just kind of in simple terms, like USSR communism at the time versus Trotskyism?
Okay, that's fine. So first, cultural Marxism. Well, after the Cold War began and the CIA started subsidizing a lot of these anti-communist intellectuals who called themselves Marxists and had a critique of Western capitalism, their focus was on art and culture rather than on the class struggle. Herbert Marcuse, who's the big intellectual of the Frankfurt School, he argued that intellectuals, not workers, would make the revolution. And that the working class had no hope because they were too brainwashed and they weren't smart enough, basically. Hannah Arendt, her writing is all about how, deep down working people are fascistic, and totalitarianism, Soviet communism and fascism and Nazism are kind of the same because they're both totalitarian. And that this movement of people that were, you can call them cultural critics, who were vaguely anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist, critiqued like consumer culture and the manipulation of media. but really anti-Soviet, equated the Soviet Union with Nazis, etc. That's where you get the Frankfurt School. That's where you get a book by Theodor Adorno called The Authoritarian Personality, which is all about how there are these people who like believe in causes that are higher than themselves and join like groups and fight for these causes, and they're really dangerous. And we need people that are just free thinking and don't associate. And it's all basically arguing that the type of person who would become a communist or could potentially become on the far right as well, the kind of person that's motivated to fight for a cause, the kind of person that might become very religious or whatever, that's the most toxic, dangerous type of personality. We need people to be free thinkers. We need people to be just to not feel like there is any truth. Postmodernism, this is cultural. This is what the right calls cultural Marxism. And they somehow try to link it to the Soviet Union, when this whole thing was created to combat the Soviet Union. And Jordan Peterson does this. Jordan Peterson is like the king of this. And he gets on there and he says, postmodern, what is it? He says, postmodern cultural Marxism. And it's like, that's Marxism and postmodernism they don't go together. They're completely contrary to each other. Postmodernism says there is no grand historical narrative, right? There is no grand historical narrative of world history. Truth comes from deconstructing such narratives, right? Whereas Marxism presents with historical materialism, an understanding of human beings and where they're going and the history of human society. Postmodernism is about taking ideologies apart and says there is no real truth. Marxism is an ideology, so they don't go together. But the right wing tries to link them to each other, and that's just silliness. Now, the next question you ask is, what about Soviet Marxism and Trotskyism? Well, Leon Trotsky, Leon Trotsky was born in Ukraine. He was in Russia. He was a Russian revolutionary. He was, a leader of the Petrograd Soviet in 1905. He spent a lot of his life in exile in Vienna and in Berlin and in London and in New York City. And he was this well-known guy from Ukraine, which was, part of the Russian Empire, who was a communist and was associated with Marxism. He didn't really get along with Lenin, but right as the revolution was happening in July of 1917, right before the October Revolution, he, surrendered and apologized for disagreeing with Lenin and joined the Bolshevik Party. And his whole life was defined by the theory of permanent revolution, which is the idea that you cannot have socialism in an underdeveloped country. If it's a country like Cuba or China or Russia, you can't have socialism there because these countries haven't become fully developed. That you can really only have socialism in a Western country because they've become fully industrialized and fully capitalist. So if you have a socialist revolution in, say, Russia or China or Cuba or Vietnam or someplace like that, all that you should really do is make the country into a big military state to try and export revolution to where it really matters, which is the United States, Germany, France, places like that. Well, the Bolsheviks took power, and it became clear there wasn't going to be a revolution in Germany, France, or someplace like that. So Stalin said, look, we've got to build socialism in one country. And Trotsky said, no, we got to carry out the permanent revolution. We can't sign treaties with the West. And that was the disagreement, the theory of permanent revolution. And really, when it gets down to it, is that Trotskyism is Eurocentric. It basically believes the West is the best. That the Western capitalist countries are the most advanced. And even though Trotsky himself was from, Ukraine, he was very much of the belief that he said New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. And he was in awe of the West. And Lenin and Bolshevism said that because of imperialism, because of the super profits and the exploitation of the third world, it's actually going to be countries like Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba that have socialism first. And it'll take a long time before revolution will come to the West. And it'll be countries in the colonized world breaking free and fighting for their liberation as a nation that will be the basis of building socialism. And Lenin took Marxism out of the West and took it to the East, whereas Trotsky was still trying to hold on to keeping Marxism in the West. And that was the difference. And when the Soviet people and Stalin and the Soviet Communist Party overwhelmingly rejected Trotsky's ideas, he went into exile. He lived in France for a while, and eventually he lived in Mexico before he was assassinated. And he formed his Fourth International, it was called. And in the name of communism, he went around preaching anti-communism, saying that the Soviet Union had sold out the revolution, that Stalin was a counter-revolutionary, And there's a lot of allegations that he collaborated with the Nazis. We know that like Benito Mussolini published his writings and circulated his writings to promote anti-communism. We know that the Nazis broadcast into the Soviet Union during World War II a Trotskyite radio program to try and incite Soviet people against the Soviet government during World War II. There's a lot of evidence that seems to indicate that even while Trotsky was alive, Trotskyism was being used as anti-communism and trying to hurt the Soviet Union. But after the Cold War began in the 1950s, at that point, it's very clear with the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other things that Trotskyism was being funded and covertly aided by the U.S. government to hurt socialist countries. That was very, very clear. I mean, there's really no question about that. I mean, if you look who Irving Howe, Irving Kristol, all these people can be traced back to the CIA. And that it was a way to say, look, you can be a Marxist, you can be a revolutionary, but you're on the side of imperialism against the socialist countries. They're not truly socialist. They're deformed workers' states. They're state capitalists, blah, blah, blah. That's Trotskyism.
Awesome answer, Caleb. I'm loving it. And Marcus, anything you want to add to this before I ask Caleb another question on the topic of Trotskyism?
Oh, I was just going to go into Caleb. Would you say that Trotskyism in today's communist Marxist circles in the United States, especially, would you say that Trotskyism has, I guess, infested it? It's you run into a lot of these types of people now. A lot of people criticize people like Stalin, people like Che Guevara, people like Fidel Castro, people that you would think would identify with the socialist cause. They try to always veer the conversation into a different realm. And there seems to be a lot of infighting among these groups. And would you say that the Trotskyite ideology still has the upper hand? And was that deliberate even to the present day?
Well, okay, so there's a couple layers to this, right? So first of all, we know that Trotskyism has historically been covertly supported by the U.S. government. But at the end of the day, I think most people like in our time, we're talking like the 21st century, who call themselves Trotskyists don't really understand Trotsky's writings or Trotsky's critique of the Soviet Union. Basically, what it gets down to is that they want to be able to say, well, I'm a communist, but not like the bad ones. They want to be able to agree with all the anti-communist propaganda that we hear in the West, but also identify with like the vague idea of socialism and Marxism. It's like an excuse. They want to say, no, I'm a Trotskyist. Don't worry. That's really what it's about. People have in their heads that Trotsky was for a more democratic socialism than Stalin. Well, Trotsky presided over all kinds of executions of anarchists and dissidents in the Soviet Union. So that's ridiculous. Trotsky's criticism of the Soviet Union, you read his book, The Revolution Betrayed, if you read the platform of his left opposition, it wasn't that, oh, Stalin's an evil dictator, I'm for democracy. He was pushing his theory of permanent revolution. But underlying the Stalin-Trotsky divide, okay, is that underneath that is the fact that there are, when it gets down to it, there are two types of people who become communists in this world. And this is true wherever you go in the world, right? Wherever you go in the world, you're going to find a group of people that are usually hanging out near university campuses, usually in urban centers, usually middle class, a little bit wealthier, and they're attracted to revolutionary ideas. They're intellectuals. They're a very small percentage of the population, and they're always there, no matter how good the economy is or whatever. They're always interested in Marxism. Those people you can call the revolutionary intelligentsia, right? And they're intellectuals. They're kind of middle class. You can call them bohemian or hippie kind of. It's this element of society of people that are interested in revolutionary politics.
The Bobos in Paradise people, for anyone that's familiar with the book, I think that's a good book to read to understand the mindset of these sorts of people.
Yeah, it's that current, okay? That current cannot make a revolution. It's never a big percentage of society. The revolution requires another group, which is the broad masses of people. And the broad masses of people are generally not interested in socialism and communism. They're only interested in it when there's a crisis, right? When a crisis grips all of society, they become interested in it because they're looking for a way out of that crisis. They don't want a cathartic explosion of violence. They want stability, and they turn to socialism and communism because they want stability. And that this tension where you have, the broad masses of people who want stability and want their lives to be less chaotic, who turn to communism out of desperation, and the revolutionary intellectuals who are are pretty comfortable in middle class, They want revolution because they're angry at the world, and they're angry about injustice, and they want cathartic explosions of rage and violence. There's a big contradiction between those two groups. They don't want the same things. The broad masses of people tend to be quite conservative. The revolutionary intelligentsia tends to be quite, liberal and free-spirited. One group wants chaos, and that's why they're attracted to Marxism. The other group wants stability, and that's why they're attracted to Marxism. And there is contradiction between those two. And Lenin in the Russian Revolution had the brilliance of bringing those two groups together, right? The Bolsheviks, yes, it started out as a lot of the children of the rich that were the revolutionary intelligentsia, but Lenin had the brilliance of getting them to operate in a way where they could organize the broad masses of Russian society and ultimately have a revolution. But Stalin very much was from that broad masses of people. He was from Georgia. He was from a rural background. He went to a seminary school.
He started out as a Georgian nationalist, if I recall correctly, too, right?
Like that. I mean, he was in a seminary, he was kicked out of seminary school, and that's how he joined the Bolsheviks. Whereas Trotsky was that revolutionary intelligentsia. Most of his life was spent hanging out in cafes in Vienna and Berlin and London and New York, and he was the revolutionary intelligentsia. And that divide between two very different groups of people that want socialism for very different reasons. During the Cold War, basically we saw during the Cold War, Western capitalism hijacked the revolutionary intelligentsia, right? And the revolutionary intelligentsia and its desire for chaos and it's just everything about that milieu, that counterculture milieu, has been basically hijacked by imperialism and manipulated by imperialism through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, through MK Ultra, through various, has been hijacked to serve their agenda of destabilizing the world, staging color revolutions, bringing down anti-imperialist states. Whereas socialism has become much more conservative, right? If you look around the world, socialist governments, they often, what they offer their population is stability. They can sometimes be quite socially conservative, opposed to gay marriage, opposed to abortion. We're seeing a rise of, in Nicaragua, the slogan of the government is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. And
it's very anti gay marriage and abortion. Like, very.
Yeah. And in China, the government is quite conservative. And that's because, look, the selling point is we control the means of production. We will make sure you don't have the instability that naturally comes with the capitalist system, right? So we're seeing socialism become more conservatism, and we're seeing become more conservative, and we're seeing the radical revolutionary middle-class intelligentsia become kind of hijacked by imperialism. And that makes the political compass of telling who's left and who's right, it makes it really confusing. Right? Because, we're in a period where, like, every time the CIA is trying to overthrow a government, you see a kid in the Occupy Wall Street Guy Fawkes mask somewhere, right? Meanwhile, you'll hear the leaders of socialist countries talk, and they'll sound quite conservative. So it gets very confusing. And that's one of the reasons that politics in our time is so confusing. And if you're a genuine anti-imperialist Marxist, the world doesn't make sense the way it once did. And that's why I've written so much. I wrote the book City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. I wrote a book about Kamala Harris, not a biography, but a book about Kamala Harris. I've tried to dig into this question because what does it mean to be a Marxist, an anti-imperialist, to be left-wing in our time when everything seems all jumbled up and confused as a result of the Cold War?
Yeah, I actually read your book about Kamala a while back. It was actually it was a while ago, but I do remember there was a certain passage where I believe her father, or at least when I was doing more research, her father was kind of, she really didn't like her, and she kind of like disowned her and said like she wasn't Jamaican, if I recall correctly, which is interesting. But I wanted to ask you this, Caleb, just for my audience so they can kind of understand a little bit better. So you kind of talked about how during these cultural revolution that was taking place in the United States that, a lot of these people were Trotskyists that would eventually become like neoconservatives, often whom would play a big role in helping the second Iraq war take place. I want you to explain to the audience the best to your ability, how do people that derive from a sort of variation of Marxism, which is Trotskyism, how did that evolutionarily process to becoming, modern neoconservatism? Because that a lot of people really don't get that, but I think you have the ability to break that down in simple terms for everybody.
Well, there's a couple of names that you can follow, right? Irving Kristol, who is considered the father of neoconservatism, right? You look at him, he actually, in his New York Times obituary, they spell it all out, and it's kind of shocking. But he was a Trotskyist. You know, he didn't like the Communist Party, thought they were too authoritarian, too pro-Soviet, but he joined, you know, this Trotskyite group. And then he got drafted to fight in World War II. And he was in the U.S. military in World War II. And according to his New York Times obituary, that was the first time he'd actually worked with working class people. You know, he was this middle class intellectual guy, and it was the first time he'd actually been with working class people. And he didn't like them. And he said, I can't build socialism with these people. He felt that they were anti-Semitic. He felt that they were ignorant and foolish, and he felt that they were working class, and he was an intellectual for a reason, and he was very much an elitist, and he didn't like the working class. And after the Second World War, he started distancing himself from Marxism and working with the CIA and such. But there's some other names. Irving Howe is another name. Now, this guy went on to become one of the founders of the Democratic Socialists of America. You know, Irving Howe was a Trotskyist. But, you know, at the time the Cold War got going, he wrote a manifesto basically saying that as a Trotskyist, as a socialist, you have to be on the West's side during the Cold War. The West, you know, the West is for freedom. Stalinism is evil, you know, vulgar totalitarianism, you know, just agreeing with all the anti-communist propaganda. Then during the Vietnam War, he started, you know, writing articles for the New York Times. And he would write these articles for the New York Times as a Marxist who was opposing the Vietnam War movement, the protest movement against the Vietnam War. And he would write like, okay, sure, the Vietnam War is bad, but these protesters are not criticizing Ho Chi Minh enough. And Ho Chi Minh is an evil Stalinist who, you know, eats people for dinner. And, you know, he'd write articles like that, right? He wrote an article, you know, saying that, you know, that because some of the anti-Vietnam War protesters were anti-Israel and were marching for Palestine, that this was covert anti-Semitism and Stalin was anti-Semitic.
Okay.
And this guy, he just, you know, I mean, and again, he went from Marxism, but opposing the Soviet Union, to basically becoming a shill for the establishment, but keeping a Marxist veneer in everything he did. And yes, at the time the Iraq War got going, a lot of the individuals associated with the invasion of Iraq had at one point been Trotskyists. By about the 80s, most of them had stopped calling themselves Marxists. It's very bizarre. I guess when DSA was founded, so there was the Socialist Party of America, right? And a lot of these Trotskyists had been in the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party of America couldn't agree about the Vietnam War. So they split three ways. And the people that were really against the Vietnam War, they're still around. They're called the Socialist Party USA. The people that were kind of against the Vietnam War became Democratic Socialists of America. And the people that actually supported the Vietnam War became the Social Democrats USA. And SDUSA, a lot of the neocons were part of SDUSA, which is still around. They have a website. I don't know who's a member of it, but they're still around, Social Democrats USA. And they were, you know, supporters of Ronald Reagan because they thought Ronald Reagan would be harder on the Stalinists, and they voted for Reagan. They were Marxists for Reagan. Yeah, you can't make this up, can you? But, you know, there you go. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Noel, you got any questions for Caleb? This is mind-blowing stuff. I love what Caleb's saying here. He's an encyclopedia of knowledge on this topic.
Yeah, it's been great. Let me ask you about decolonization theory and the fame that they have in American academia and whether or not it's related to Marxism.
Well, I mean, Marx himself was not particularly good on issues like that. You know, Marx argued there was no nations. It was just workers and capitalists, workers of the world unite. Towards the final years of Marx's life, he started to embrace the Irish freedom struggle. And he wrote some letters to Frederick Engels where he was supporting the Irish freedom struggle. His daughter started wearing a crucifix, even though she was an atheist, to support the Irish Catholics. So Marx was kind of starting to change on that point. But Marx was kind of Eurocentric. But it was Lenin who came up with this understanding that there are nations, right, that are oppressed as nations. And because capitalism has become imperialism, the global monopoly capitalist system, you know, that oppressed nations can struggle for their national liberation, and one should support oppressed nations. And, you know, Lenin and others argued that there are not just oppressed nations within the developing world. They're not just like land masses, you know, that there are peoples. A nation is a people with a common language, a common heritage, a common culture, and a common economy. And that, you know, that within Western imperialist countries, you do have colonized people. And you know, black people in the United States, according to many Marxists, constitute a colonized people. They have their own dialect. They have their own neighborhoods where they're ghettoized. They have their own religious groups. They have their own culture. And that the black people, even though they live in the United States, they are a colonized nation within U.S. borders. And that the Chicano people, right, of you know, the parts of the USA that once belonged to Mexico, Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, you know, that they have their own culture, their own language, etc., and that they constitute a nation.
I was going to say, Marx supported the Americans in the Mexican-American War, I believe, because he thought it would kind of speed up or accelerate the industrialization process of Mexico. Am I correct?
Right. And Engels disagreed with him on that point.
Okay.
But, yeah, Marx was completely wrong on that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Go into the Chicanos if you could. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're okay.
Well, I want to add real quick since I have a little space here about the Chicano, which is essentially an American-born Hispanic. I understand that label of kind of oppressed nation is taken up or even imposed upon, and I consider myself a part of this group as well because I'm an American-born Hispanic. But I really do reject that notion of we're an oppressed nation. Yeah, we're abused, we're taken advantage of, but I feel like when you put it in the context of oppressed nation, it's almost like you didn't have a choice, and I feel like our history, we've had choices, and unfortunately, we made the wrong ones, and so we've ended up in the situation we are. But my point is that for those in the audience that may be familiar with my work, for me, it's important that we don't feel like a victim class, that we just kind of own up, like, hey, I think we miscalculated here, and clearly that's what the present moment is showing us. Let's undo our mistake. So I just wanted to make that point.
All right. Well, and that's why it's tricky, right? And that, as a Marxist, one is obligated to support colonized people who want independence. However, right, it gets tricky because, I think the majority of black people in the United States do not want a separate black nation, a separate black country. They don't.
No, they don't. Absolutely
yeah, I would
not.
agree. I would agree.
In the 1930s, the Communist Party came out with a map they actually had a map of where the independent black Soviet republic would be. Well, that's not appropriate, I don't think, because and if the majority of black people were saying, yes, we want an independent country, here's where we want it to be, I would support that. But for me as a white guy walking around with like, hey, here's where all the black people should live, that sounds like segregation, right? So I don't go around promoting that, and the same with the question of people who want like Aztlan or the Sun Belt or the Old Southwest to break away or rejoin Mexico. Again, if the majority of American Chicanos wanted that, I would support that. But as a white guy, for me to go around and like with a map and explain, oh, this is where all that wouldn't look good. You know what I mean? And again, it's not.
Yeah.
The colonized people also have the right not to separate. They have the right to integrate.
Yeah, Caleb, honestly, that's great stuff. Like, I actually support the Southwest being reclaimed by Hispanics and eventually rejoining Mexico as well. But then I would also conversely say, because I'm not white, I don't think that I should go around saying what the white working class should be doing as a result of that. So I totally, I think we can have a definite mutual respect here. Doesn't have to be hostile at all. And Marcus, anything you want to add to this before I ask some other questions here that we have?
I think I'm good. I'm just right now just following the conversation. It's great.
I wanted to make a brief point before you move on, Guillermo, about the issue, Caleb. That like we've noticed is that essentially the American decolonial theory is used to try to separate Hispanics along racial lines, and as I'm sure you're very well aware, we're a very mixed people, right? Like I may have a cousin of your complexion, I may have a cousin of more of an African complexion. Being from Nicaragua, we kind of have the three races there. So, do you have anything to touch on that point?
Well, real quick, just to add on to that, Caleb, this is kind of like a problem that we've been running into lately, where and we've been getting a lot of hate from sort of the racialists in both the black online and the white online racialists, because we've entered this moment where these racialists who are just genuinely, I'm talking about the genuinely hateful ones, like they're in this situation where their ideology is just so fractured and marginalized at this point in terms of like the actual just straight up just open supremacists, that now they're getting desperate, in my opinion, and they're openly looking for Hispanics to recruit to both like white nationalist causes, but also they look more towards our towards like people like maybe from the Caribbean, people from like the more triracial or blacker parts of like Colombia or other parts of the coast of South America. And they're trying to recruit us to their racialized causes. Like, what is your kind of like how, from your perspective, why do you think that's happening, that these sorts of like, extremely hateful, like racist groups are, they went from like seeing us as just outsiders, and now they kind of like want this flesh blood into their movements?
Well, let me put it in this context. As somebody who has gone around talking to other white people about Marxism my whole life. I mean, since I've been in high school, I've been trying to promote Marxism, and my main audience has been other white people. I have met many, many low-income white people that I tell them, yeah, the means of production, the economy should be controlled so that everyone has a job and housing, and they're totally on board. And then the second that I say something about police brutality or discrimination or something, they get this angry look on their face, and it's, oh, you're one of those, aren't you? And then they proceed to tell me that racism is not real. It's been invented. It's been made up. And the reason that they know this, they will then tell me, is they'll list all kinds of bad things that have happened to them in their life. Well, police were mean to me one time, so clearly there's no racism. I lost my job, and I'm white, so clearly there's, and they start listing ways that they've suffered, right? And that is why they're angry at black people, and that's why there's no racism. And how does this make any sense? It doesn't make any sense, but it does make sense if class politics has been written out of the conversation. If we have Dr. Martin Luther King and his holiday, we know about racism, there's conversations about it in the United States, but class politics, class struggle has been written out of anything. So a lot of white people can only they feel like they can only acknowledge oppression on racial grounds. So they get very defensive about their own suffering because they can only see it in terms of race. And that makes them ample recruiting material for these white supremacist groups, because class struggle politics has been so written out of American dialogue that the fact that black people have it worse, the fact that black people face police brutality at far higher rates, the fact that the rate of unemployment and the conditions of the black community are worse, does not mean that they haven't suffered. It doesn't take away from the fact that they suffer as working people, but no one has ever given them permission to feel like they're oppressed as working people. No one's ever given them that permission. Right. And that's the toxicity of IDPOL, is it's like, class politics, the understanding of the 99% and the 1%, the capitalists who own society and the rest of us, has been just written out. So the only way you're able to feel that you are oppressed is if you can claim like a special oppression status. That puts a lot of white workers on the defensive. And it leads to this toxic conversation. Whose life is worse? My life is worse. No, my life is worse. And this toxic conversation. If you determine that the pie is only this big, the only way the pie can get, your slice of the pie can get any bigger is by cutting into somebody else's slice. And that's what ends up happening. And this is exactly the conversation the imperialists want. They want the working people at each other's throats, fighting over the crumbs while all of us get poorer.
Absolutely, Caleb. And I was going to ask you this real quickly. Marcus and I have been doing a lot of research into Noel Ignatieff. There's been a lot of memes about him on the internet, usually promoted by the far right, saying that he's this extremely hateful, or he was this hateful guy that apparently wanted to exterminate white people and that he was just horrible. So Marcus and I actually started doing just original research on this, and we're going to be doing a book review on this soon. We found out this guy's been completely lied about his entire life. Like, he was someone that understood that whiteness was not a real thing. It was a made up category in order to essentially serve as a consolation prize for poor white people that really had nothing else but, this feeling of inherent superiority over, people that are considered to be non-white. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on, because I don't think Ignatieff really got to talk about this too much, but I'm of the opinion that right now the United States is currently undergoing a situation where they are in the process of trying to kind of absorb Hispanics, I think Northeast Asians, and very well-off like Indians from like India, for example, into the overall white population over the course of time. I was just wondering what you think of this hypothesis is that I just put out to you, and whether you think Hispanics should embrace the idea of whiteness or not, because this is actually a big problem in our community, where like a lot of Hispanics now, unfortunately, or I should say, an alarming percentage want to sort of be absorbed into this overall white identity, and they don't want to embrace their actual Hispanic roots.
Not just white, but also black.
Black too, but yeah, white for sure as well.
Well, I can't comment on that really.
Sure.
I just don't know enough about it. One thing that I have seen a lot of is that there are, there are some immigrant groups that come to the United States, Asian Americans, Indian Americans they come to the United States, and they have seen a lot of the racist propaganda that goes all over the world against black people. And they come to the United States determined to let everyone know that they are not black people. And that is tragic. It's really tragic, right? As somebody, I used to go out on the street as an RT reporter and interview random people on the street. I'll tell you, some of the most racist things I've ever heard on the street did not come from white people. They came from people from India who were trying to reassure me that they are not a black person and will say awful things about black people. And that's tragic. And then I'll always point out to them, I say, my grandparents think you're black. So, it doesn't matter, it's really kind of tragic. And, that when, the racism of the United States, the stereotypes that we have here in the United States, et cetera, they go all over the world. US media goes all over the world.
It's one of the most interesting. Oh, sorry, Guillermo.
Sorry if I'm sorry if you don't hear me correctly. I have problems with my mic, but I'm
here, Carlos. I'll let you ask your question, and then Marcus, you're going to go after, and then Rancho after. I just want to make sure there's a good order that we're doing this in.
Okay,
all right.
Just one question. So Caleb, why do you think? But I feel like the left have participated in these racial divisions. I'm talking about, for example, the book of Settlers.
Mm.
So why do you think the left participate in the division of the working class in America?
Well, the book Settlers, that's a mysterious book, and we can talk about the background of it maybe, but the thesis of the book is basically that white workers in the United States are not really working class. That because they are white, because of their settler privilege or whatever, they may technically sell their labor power to a boss, but they benefit so much from their white privilege that they're not part of the working class. And I think that's a particularly toxic narrative, especially at a time when we're seeing a very big drop in the standard of living of a lot of white American workers. And that lays the basis for solidarity. Look, a lot of issues that the black community has been protesting and organizing resistance to for years are now hitting the white community, right? There is anger at the police and police state repression and police brutality in the white community like never before. There is, around the opioid epidemic and the war on drugs. Never has the white community been so opposed to the war on drugs as they are now. But by making it an ID poll conversation, instead of it becomes, wow, now the white people can join with the black people against the police state, the conversation shifts to, oh, it's, they're only complaining about it now, but it would be so much worse if they were black. Oh, and then, of course, the white people say, but black people always get attention for this, but no one cares when it happens to white. And it becomes this conversation about it's not unifying to resolve the problem of police state repression. It becomes a toxic conversation about who's the most oppressed. And the same around the drugs issue, right? I mean, heroin has been taking the lives of a lot of low-income white people, and there's been a lot of push for more compassion and such. And again, here's a moment to recognize how the war on drugs has devastated the black community and how white people were wrong to go along with it. And now there can be solidarity against the war on drugs. But no, what there is there's an ID poll conversation about how, it would be worse or this or that. And it turns into this conversation where instead of finding common ground and building a unified working class program, instead we have just this downward spiral of people blaming each other and getting more hostile to each other. And that's particularly dangerous because right now a lot of low-income white people are seeing their living standards go down. They're facing heavier police state repression, the suicide rate and all of that. And now there's potential for them to join arm in arm with the black community around these issues that affect the entire working class. And the ruling class of the United States is determined to make sure that does not happen. Right. And they're trying to whipsaw the population. There's an old device called a whipsaw. And that's a saw with a handle on both sides. And like when the one guy's pushing, the other guy's pulling. The other guy's pulling, the other guy's pushing. And, it has been beaten into the heads of a lot of low-income white people that the only way they can gain is at the expense of black folks. And it is now being pushed, onto a lot of people of color, that the only way they can gain is at the expense of low-income white people. And that this narrative that one section of the working class has to join with one section of the capitalist class to kick the ass of another section of the working class, that is what the imperialists want to do. It's part of their Bonapartist process. And it's part of transitioning all of the United States to a lower standard of living, which is how imperialism is moving. In this high-tech age, you don't need an industrial working class in the homeland any longer. And it's part of just transitioning the whole population to a lower standard of living. But now should be the time that we develop a unified working class program of resistance to the low-wage police state. Black and white, unite and fight, better jobs, better conditions, and the police state, civil liberties for all. That should be the demand. Now we should build a unified working class program. We shouldn't be joining in the pitting of sections of the working class against each other to serve the agenda of different capitalists.
Good answer. Yes. And Marcus, do you have any follow-up questions for this? And then we'll go to Rancho after.
Sure. I've got three now. The first one is, I don't know if you've ever read White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg, Caleb.
Never.
Have you ever? It breaks down basically the origins of class and how it was used mainly against the white working class, or even the white farmers, the subsistence farmers in the United States from the beginning, from before the founding all the way to the present day. And she writes a chapter from the end of Reconstruction all the way up until maybe the 50s or the 60s. And she discusses how you had these alleged populist politicians that would come out and speak to the white working class. And it was they would use racial hatred to get these people to vote for them, to try to, claiming that they would better their lives at the expense of African Americans mainly. And nothing was ever given to these people. Race was used as almost a placating tool in order so they wouldn't have to give these people anything, any kind of better living conditions. And then it goes down to these politicians when they're speaking in Washington, D.C., they're talking about their poor white constituents. Oh, these people aren't, they're not good enough to have a refrigerator, or they're not good enough to have indoor plumbing, or these people aren't good enough to be able to taught how to read and write. And it's just amazing when you really think about it. It's race has never benefited the poor white person in this country, and it's really kept them docile, in a way. It's interesting. And the second question I asked is, you mentioned black and white unite and fight. Would you like to talk about Fred Hampton and what he accomplished back in the 60s? And actually what happened to him how he was assassinated.
So Marcus, real quickly, I'll let you ask the third question as well, but I'm asking you please to put all of them and all the questions in here in the private chat, just so Caleb can look and reference them as he's answering them for you in here.
Okay.
Keep going though.
Okay. Yeah. The first question really is about Fred Hampton and how his example and just how quickly he was stifled by the intelligence agencies and various police departments and whatnot.
Sure. Fred Hampton, his program, he talked about a rainbow coalition. He had an alliance with different ethnic groups and such. But what Fred Hampton was doing was really a continuation of the opposite of what you were talking about at the beginning, about how the racism and the use of racism to rally white workers never really benefited them. It was just a fake demagogy, right? And I believe it was the Democratic Party that would beat the drum of, the Republicans are going to give good government jobs to black people. That's why you got to vote for the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson and others pushed that line, and it never really benefited low-income white people. But what did benefit low-income white people was the abolition of slavery.
I was going to say real quickly, Woodrow Wilson also, foreign policy wise, was kind of the guy who started promoting nationalism all over the world as well. But yeah, just wanted to add that on and keep going, Caleb. Sorry.
Right. The abolition of slavery and Reconstruction is largely how low-income white people in the U.S. South got public education. Most low-income white people in the South didn't have schools to go to until Reconstruction. It wasn't until the labor movement got over racism in the 1930s because of the Communist Party that white workers won industrial unions. It used to be that whenever white workers would go on strike, the white workers' unions were almost always whites only, that the black people would be used as replacement labor. But when the Communist Party and William Z. Foster and others came along and they said, you know what, we're going to put the needs of the black community into the demands of the strikes, and the black community and the white community work together. That's how they were able to build these industrial unions. In the dock workers strike of 1934, whenever the dock workers had gone on strike before that in San Francisco, what would happen was that the black community would be used as replacement workers on the docks. But the Communist Party went to all the black churches in San Francisco and made clear that they were going to demand in the strike that black workers be allowed to work on the docks, and that they would have a hiring hall so they could make sure that black workers got represented on the docks. And when the Communist Party did that, the black community supported the strike, and it was successful. The 1934 San Francisco strike, it was successful, and it built one of the most successful, militant labor unions in the USA, the International Longshore Warehouse Union. The Flint sit-down strike of 1937, they call it Labor's Gettysburg. There was only one black worker in the auto plant where that sit-down strike happened. But when they marched out of the plant victorious, they had that one black auto worker carry the flag to make a point. And it was because they included the anti-racism in the demands of that strike that the black community was able to eventually get jobs in the auto plants, and that racism has always hurt white workers. But when white workers have joined arm in arm with black workers, that's when they've advanced. So the idea that white workers gain at the expense of black people, that's the narrative of white supremacists. That's the narrative of these demagogic politicians that you talked about. That's also the narrative of this Settlers book. And it's wrong. The gains for white workers have come when they stood arm in arm with black workers. And that is what communists have always understood. If you read Labor's Untold Story, one of the most important labor history books I've ever read, it makes that point, right? That when black workers and white workers join arm in arm and struggle, and when the needs of the black community are put into the demands of the overall struggle, that's when all workers gain, including white workers.
I think.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Guillermo. I think one of the main problems of socialist movements across the Western world is precisely that they're not able to unify the working class. I'm thinking of in Spain, for example, with all the separatist movement and all of that, who basically tried to make a clash between the working classes of Catalonia and southern Spain and the Basque region, for example. But even Marx in the Communist Manifesto said that the working class should become the national class, and that's something that people used to avoid when we're talking about the national question in Marxism. They avoid that question. They only reach the part of, oh, workers have no nation, but they completely miss the part of workers need to put themselves first as the national class, because for Marxism, the political nation, which was the construction of the Jacobins in France, right, is the canonical model for the communist revolution. You make the revolution from the nation.
Sure. I mean, the Communist Manifesto, it says that the demands will be different and the program will be different in every country. And it's also important to note that the first dictatorship of the proletariat, the Paris Commune of 1871, was very much a nationalist revolt. The capitalists of France, the capitalist government, had surrendered to the Prussian invaders. So the workers of Paris, wanting to defend the legacy of the French Revolution, wanting to not be, colonized and be slaves of the Prussians, they took up arms and defended the city of Paris. And that's how the first dictatorship of the proletariat was. And they waved the tricolor flag of the French Revolution, and they sang the French Revolutionary anthem. They rewrote the lyrics to be more working class and proletarian. And the national question, the idea that there is a community in a country, that the people of a country have a unified vision and a unified goal, that is something that Marxists have generally acknowledged. The ultimate goal is to have a unified global working class and a global economy, but there is going to be organizing within one country, and there is going to be national struggles also.
Yeah,
So
very good. And No, keep going, Carlos. Sorry, but after Carlos is done, Marcus, ask whatever question you had on your mind, and then because I got to go through a lot of questions here that I have saved for Caleb.
Yeah, this is probably going to be my last question. Considering that Marx was pretty Americanophilic, he was very Anglophilic in the sense of supporting the U.S. Why do you think American leftists are so scared of patriotism?
I think that this largely comes from the Vietnam War era. Look, the Communist Party USA, they went ultra patriotic. I mean, they would say that if Washington and Lincoln were alive today, they would be members of the Communist Party. The Communist Party USA used to have Jefferson bookstores named after Thomas Jefferson, and they kind of went over the top with being patriotic. But in the New Left era, most of the working class, most of the people who were white and were working class, were not interested in the Vietnam War movement, were conservative, were hostile. And it was alienated, college students, youth who didn't want to fight in Vietnam, and the black community that were the basis of the revolutionary movement. And there became this feeling that average Americans, average white working class Americans, that they are a bunch of rednecks and racists, and the flag is the flag that they rally around with their redneck and racism, and so we don't want to associate with that, right? And I guess that because American patriotism became so associated with anti-communism, because there was kind of, it was that revolutionary intelligentsia, the alienated intellectual folks among white people that got attracted to communism, because black nationalism was a big current that a lot of white revolutionaries were supporting. You got this mindset that, okay, we're not going to be patriotic on the left. We're gonna reject America, and all of that. And I think that's a mistake. I've broken with that, and I've gotten a lot of flack for it. But no, that's not the proper orientation. We should be telling people we're the real patriots. If you really love America, you should be a socialist. I tell people I'm a socialist because I want to save America, not because I want to destroy America. I want to dismantle imperialism. Absolutely. I want to get rid of the legacy of racism and colonialism. Absolutely. But that will make the country I live in better. And my goal is not to just tear everything down and burn it up. My goal is to build a better America for working families.
Very insightful. And Marcus, can you ask whatever you had on your mind here?
Sure. We already touched on Noel Ignatieff, and it was really interesting about him when I started looking through a lot of his stuff. He would answer letters to anyone. If you wrote him, he would answer white supremacists who would call him an effing K-word slur. And he would actually explain his position and break it down and dismantle these people's arguments just on paper. And one of the things he would mention is an anecdote from when he was an iron worker. Before he got into academia, he was a manual laborer, and mostly in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Chicago area, I think in Ohio as well. So this would have been in the 60s or 70s, that a lot of Eastern European immigrants, or the children of the immigrants, they started siding with the African American workers to demand better treatment, better pay, better working conditions. And at one point, when they were about to walk out on strike, the bosses came in and actually started telling these people, hey, look, we're going to take you in now. We're going to accept you as white. Last week, we were using slurs to describe you. We were talking behind your backs. We were calling you animals, et cetera, et cetera. But now, hey, you're one of us now. So just get back to work and don't join these other ones on strike. And he watched how it would break up any kind of worker solidarity. And that really seems to be the basis of his academic thesis, that capitalism was so fluid in this country. It was so adaptable that it would be able to take race and it would be able to shift it and move it and incorporate new peoples into it so that they can prevent any kind of actual solidarity emerging among the working class. Do you have anything really to add on that? Is there anything you'd like to say about that? Like, it was very interesting when I read it.
When I saw Michael Moore's film, Where to Invade Next, and he was going on and on about how great the welfare states of Norway and Sweden and France and countries like that are, I couldn't help but think that what was missing from that was that the reason we don't have that here in the USA isn't that we just don't protest enough, but it's about race. That, when you say welfare mother in the United States, everybody knows that's a code word for black woman, even though the majority of women with children who get government assistance are white, right? And that by racializing things like the welfare state, you can get some of the poorest people to oppose food stamps, because if you tell them, well, this is going to, people who don't look like you, who you don't identify with, they'll go along with cuts in food stamps. And that economic issues in the United States, the only way they've really gotten so many white working class people to vote against their own interest and to favor neoliberal economic policies is by making them racial. And that is a deep tragedy. And that was missing from Michael Moore's movie. He made it sound like, well, they just protest more in Europe. Well, they do protest more in Europe, but it's not just that, right? That right now there is a big rolling back of the welfare state in Europe, largely because there is a lot of migrants and refugees coming in, and they're able to start doing the same thing. Oh, sure, you want people in your neighborhood to get welfare and stuff, but should we give all of these migrants, free food? And they're using it in the exact same way, right? And by racializing these issues, they can break the solidarity, right? And that people are trained to sympathize with people in their own community, and often are trained to think of other people in other communities as being freeloaders or lazy or whatever. And that's an effective way of hurting the entire working class.
Awesome. And I want to ask you this, Caleb, in as brief terms as you can, just and then I'll let Rancho ask any other question he wants after you're finished with this one. Could you explain for the audience here, sort of like once Mao had done his guerrilla warfare campaign successfully, came into power, and then upon him passing away, from Mao getting into office, and then eventually Deng and his reforms, and up to Xi and his current economic model that built upon what Deng started. How has the system evolved, and what were the good and bad parts, you would say, in the highlights from these specific times in which I guess the economy of China had been transforming radically, beginning with the communist revolution that took place there?
Wow, I mean, we went from racism all the way over to the Chinese Revolution. But, wow. I mean, I'll quickly summarize because there's a lot there. But, right after the Chinese Revolution, the 1950s, China largely had a market economy. With Soviet assistance, they built a lot of government steel mills and government power plants and stuff. But there were millionaires and wealthy people in China in the 1950s. And they had largely a market economy. There was land redistribution and stuff. But it was in the cities, it was pretty much capitalism with the Communist Party in charge, kind of regulating everything. Then in the 1960s, with the Great Leap Forward and then the Cultural Revolution, they went to trying to build, a Soviet-style economy. And the Soviet Union cut off its aid, and they were doing that in order to prove that they were, the true communists. The Soviets were revisionists. They put up Stalin's picture, next to Mao's picture, Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. And that there was this feeling that, they were going to build a Stalin-style economy. But China is extremely poor. It's just, it started out at a far lower level of development than even Russia had at the time of the Russian Revolution. So, Nixon went to China. The Gang of Four were kind of aligning China with U.S. foreign policy in the early 70s up until the mid 80s, really. China was very poor, and it was with Deng Xiaoping that you had the rise of socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the market reforms, where they would allow foreign investment to come in, but be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, be regulated by the Chinese Communist Party, and that would enable there to be a rise in living standards. And there was explosive amounts of economic growth in the 1980s and 90s, and right up to today in China, because they have allowed foreign investment to bring in foreign wealth and resources into China, with the Communist Party taxing it, with directing it and controlling it, but allowing foreign investment and market zones, etc. And then the Chinese Communist Party has also subsidized and created a lot of corporations that are nominally private, but at the end of the day, they trade primarily with the Chinese government. They do with what the government tells them to do. Like Huawei Technologies is technically a private company, right? But the board of directors are people in the Chinese military. Its main business partner is the Chinese military. And at the end of the day, while Huawei is technically it's a profit-sharing cooperative that is a private company under Chinese law, it's really an arm of the state centrally planned economy. It just, it has a lot of investors who get a return on their investment and make profits. And that's, you know, a lot of companies in China are like that, where a lot of the domestic Chinese companies are technically private, but they are so closely controlled by the government, and they're so intricately tied in with state-run industries and with, you know, government banks and subsidies. They're not really according to private. They're not functioning according to profit. You know, capitalism is a system of profits in command. Under capitalism, the means of production, as Frederick Engels said, only function as preliminary transformation into capital. You know, Mao Zedong, he said capitalism is a system of profits in command. You look at the Chinese economy, even in the private sector, profits are not in command. The Communist Party, with its 90 million members and people organized in communities and neighborhoods, they're in command. There's a lot of, you know, what you might call capitalism with private companies making profits. But at the end of the day, the economy is controlled by the state and by the Communist Party. And that state and that party derive their strength from a well-organized population, you know, of 90 million people that are organized into the Chinese Communist Party. The state is not simply a front for capitalist power. The state has contrary interests to the capitalists and has even executed a few billionaires, from what I understand.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're describing that, you know, there is like an ideological Marxist-Leninist vanguard that kind of plays as the referee regarding and utilizes, for example, so Richard Nixon and the Republican Party, they were kind of the ones that opened the door to allowing China to do this. I think was a very smart move of kind of like economic jujitsu, in which they were able to utilize the momentum of the United States economy, but plan it in such a way centrally so that, you know, the American government would not be undermining China at the same time, which I think is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And yeah, I think that's great. And I would ask you this, Caleb, or I wouldn't ask you this. I just wanted to, or I just kind of wanted to say, I think it's kind of funny that the Republican Party is kind of, they've helped prop up China in such a way now, to the point where like now China is on the trajectory to outpacing America in so many ways economically. And now they're resorting to racism and all of this xenophobic rhetoric on China, despite the fact that these were the people that built China up in the first place. I just think it's funny. But yeah, Rancho, anything you want to ask before I move on to another question here?
Yeah, a couple things. I just wanted to note that someone in the audience asked if you've heard this notion, Caleb, of China being a Han supremacist state, or if it's been influenced by kind of fascist writers like Carl Schmitt, for example. But then I have my actual question, but I just wanted to share that with you.
Well, there's two things there. As far as China being a Han supremacist state, you know, China at this point especially is spending a lot of its money and resources to fund not just poverty alleviation in Tibet and in the Uyghur regions, but on top of just like economic development, to fund the culture of those regions. The Chinese government is building mosques all over the Uyghur regions. The Chinese government has built all kinds of Tibetan traditional monasteries. So the idea, you know, and this is commonly reported in U.S. media, that China's trying to wipe out Tibetan Buddhism. No, they're not, because Tibetan Buddhist tourism is such a big revenue for China. They would be stupid to do that, right? They're trying to wipe out Islam. No, they're trying to wipe out terrorism and
Wahhabism promoted by the CIA, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, they're building mosques all over the Muslim regions. If you're a Muslim and you are not trying to overthrow the Chinese government, and you can make, not breaking the law and not being a terrorist fit with your Islam, they'll subsidize you basically. So
crazy stuff.
That part. As far as Carl Schmitt, though, that's interesting, because see, now there's a grain of truth in that second one, because if you read Carl Schmitt's writings, Carl Schmitt, you know, in a way, he's a little bit more of a realist. Like, he was a fascist, he was an admirer, he was a Nazi, but he wrote about the capitalist state with honesty, that bourgeois law is just a front for might makes right in a lot of cases, right? And he admits that, right? In the United States, we're taught about how great our legal system is, right? That our legal system is so amazing, and that's bullshit. It's rigged, right? That USA is just like any other society, which is, if the people in power, if the state and you know, the people that control the state, the wealthy folks, want to go after you, if you're well connected enough, and you might be able to make a deal or somehow avoid punishment, but for the most part, you're screwed. And if you look at that in the United States, the conviction rate, I mean, most cases don't even go to trial in the United States. You know, it's like 99.9% of cases don't go to trial. If you do go to trial, the conviction rate is like 75 80%, usually 90%. Your
Even
chances.
worse when it's the federal government going after you too.
Right. And Carl Schmitt's writings basically says all of what I'm saying when he's talking about Germany. He says, look, let's just admit it, that state power is a vehicle to carry out an agenda. Let's stop pretending that state power is, oh, it's about these lofty ideals. No, it's not. State power carries out an agenda. Marxists think that too. They just want to carry out a very different agenda than fascists do. Okay, that's the difference, right? So Carl Schmitt probably, the Chinese legal system, just like the Soviet legal system, recognizes that the state as an institution does have an agenda, does carry out that agenda. It's not just this lofty institution that stands above society and administers justice. A Marxist could agree with a lot of what Carl Schmitt wrote about the state. They would just argue that you should use the state not for a fascist agenda, but rather for a Marxist and socialist agenda. But that it rips apart the mythology of bourgeois law.
Yeah, great stuff. And Marcus, I think you have a question here. Can you ask Caleb this?
Yeah, so I mean, you've mentioned the Deng reforms in China, and would you like to compare and contrast to say how the Soviet Union started to fall into decline, or the stagnation under Brezhnev? Really, it started under Khrushchev, and where the Soviet Union may have gone wrong in not implementing some limited reforms.
Well, look, at one point in my life, I was of the mindset that, the Stalin-era Soviet Union, the means of production, they had all that economic growth, they defeated Hitler, but then Khrushchev came in and started taking it apart, and they deviated from that system, and that's why they fell. There's some truth in that, but overall, that narrative is a little bit flawed, because really the problems that led to the fall of the Soviet Union, what it really got down to was that Soviet society, in the process, 15 countries invaded them after the fall, after the Russian Revolution. They had World War II. They had constant threats and subversion against them. And in response to that, the Soviet Union became a very rigid and authoritarian society. You had, the Moscow trials and the purges, and you had an atmosphere where average people largely felt like it wasn't really safe for them to get involved in politics, that politics was particularly dangerous, and that we'll let the party, we'll let the people in the Communist Party, we'll let them handle the politics, but we're just going to kind of stay out of it because we don't want to get killed, and it's a little bit dangerous and all of that. So average people weren't really politicized, and the political structure that existed was very rigid. And the Soviet, parliament, or what did you call it, the Supreme Soviet, all the votes were unanimous. Everyone didn't agree, but all the disagreement was done behind closed doors in whispered meetings. People would get together and say, well, what are we going to do? And they would reach kind of a consensus behind closed doors, and then they would publicly have a vote, and everyone agreed. It was unanimous, right? Well, that atmosphere created an atmosphere that was very easy to manipulate by the imperialists. Brzezinski and the CIA, they studied the Soviet Union, and they realized that, there were problems in the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. I mean, there was a problem, right? There was a generational shift going on in the leadership. The younger people in the Communist Party had a very different perspective than the older folks. There was, average people in the Soviet Union were not heavily involved in politics because it was seen as kind of too risky. And the CIA was able to, Western capitalism and the CIA, they were able to cultivate one section of the Soviet Communist Party to believe that the Americans weren't so bad, that the Americans were not going to, destroy the country, that the USA would help them transition to be like Norway or Sweden. And so you had Gorbachev coming in and announcing he didn't believe in Marxism anymore. He believed in universal human values, and that he was going to basically, the feeling for Gorbachev was that he was going to transform the Soviet Union to be like Norway or Sweden, like a European welfare state. Okay? There was another wing of the Soviet Communist Party that argued that that they were more sympathetic to Stalin, they were more sympathetic to the state-run economy, but they felt like they fit it in, they kind of broke with the Marxist narrative and fit it in with Orthodox nationalism and traditionalism. They saw Stalin as almost like a great czar, and that the Russian people have a different heritage and such. And so, beneath the surface in the Soviet Communist Party, publicly, they were all saying exactly the same thing. There was one party line. But beneath the surface, there were contradictory views. And on top of that, average people were not involved in politics. And so, perestroika was really that pro-Western wing, finally kind of assuming leadership of the party and trying to implement market reforms. And in the atmosphere of implementing these market reforms and political reforms with glasnost, which, you know, were probably intended to make the Soviet Union into Norway or Sweden. The result of that was enough political chaos and protests and confusion and the coup, and eventually the Soviet Union was dismantled. And it didn't become Norway or Sweden. It became a free market nightmare in the 1990s with Boris Yeltsin and mass suffering and neoliberalism and shock therapy. But the problem with the Soviet Union was that its structure became so rigid that you know, just trying to tamper with it, changing it, opened the floodgates to the whole thing falling apart. I've repeated many times, I've said the Soviet Union could not bend, and so it broke. The Chinese system is able to bend very effectively. And in fact, one of the strengths of the Chinese Communist Party is they're constantly evolving. China in the 50s was different than China in the 60s. China in the 70s was different than China in the 60s. China in the 80s was different than the 90s. I mean, it's like, when has China been the same? You know, China is constantly updating and evolving its system. You know, and that's why they're able to stay strong. And the same can be said for Vietnam and for Cuba and for some of the other socialist countries, is that they haven't developed that rigidity that was the result of just the onslaught that hit Soviet society. You know, in Cuba, you know, I mean, one of the big problems of Soviet society was the way that dissidents were dealt with, right? You know, coming out of World War II, you know, I mean, again, you know, during World War II, you had these, you know, fascist uprisings all throughout the country. You had generals that went over to Hitler's side. And so coming out of World War II, in Soviet society, basically, if you were going around saying anti-communist stuff, eventually, you know, people might ignore you for a little while. But after a while, you disappeared and were dragged away in the middle of the night. No one ever heard from you.
Especially if you had like clout in your local communities, right?
If you had what? Yeah.
Like clout.
Right. And, you know, that was done because there was a feeling that, you know, dissidents, they could become Nazis. They could try to overthrow our system. We have to do this. The thing is that if you do that, their argument never gets answered. Right? Their argument never gets answered. It almost seems like a confession on the part of the government that these people have something right. On top of that, the population feels kind of threatened, like, hey, why? Why am I not allowed to think what I want to think? Why am I not allowed to say what I want to say? So there's a resentment that develops among the whole population, among people that might not even agree with that person, might be the most pro-communist people. They're going to feel like, hey, that's not cool. But if you look at Cuba, the way Cuba handles this is when there's a dissident, when there's a person who's going around bad-mouthing Fidel Castro, they'll mobilize people in the community and in the neighborhood who support Fidel Castro to go argue with that person and say, no, you're wrong. And that brings the people into the political process, number one. That, you know, lets the person make their arguments. The person doesn't get dragged away in the middle of the night. They're able to keep making their arguments, but it politicizes the population, and it has a totally different effect. And again, it's kind of breaking with that rigidity. You know, there are a lot of people in China who have different views. You know, there's people in China all over social media who are critical of the Chinese government, but there's a lot of people in China who are pro-Chinese government, and they speak up and they give their opinion. And by doing that, the population is brought into politics. The arguments of these anti-communists get answered. It's a much better way of handling disagreements.
Not only that, but I would argue too, Caleb, that under very hyper totalitarian societies, maybe like North Korea would be an example, a very disproportionate amount of resources get spent into shutting people up, and that could be better served actually improving the material conditions of the proletarian. But I'm glad we actually got onto this topic, because I want to kind of ask you like two things. The first part is for the audience, because a lot of them don't understand that once the Soviet Union kind of fell, Boris Yeltsin was this U.S. kind of like patsy that they kind of put in charge in order to open up the markets of Russia. Things that were state-owned would eventually be bought up. I was just wondering if you could kind of real quickly explain sort of how horrible that process was, like how many people it affected and what sort of conditions they had to live under as a result of the government basically putting up all of these former state industries for sale. And then afterwards, I would like you to tell the audience sort of like what you think of Alexander Dugin and the fourth political theory, you know, what you kind of like think is good about it and what you kind of disagree, just so we can have your nuanced take on the man, because he's a person that creates a lot of division all over the internet, I've noticed.
Okay. Well, as far as, I mean, you know, I was a kid in the 90s, and the narrative that I got from media and from the teachers and all that, I thought that in Russia in the 90s, everyone was just jumping up and down the whole time going, we're free, yay! And it was just a great time in Russia because everyone was just so happy to be free and to finally be free from communism, and they had more money and everyone was happy. That's not what happened. The fall of the Soviet Union is one of the biggest economic disasters in history. A country that had been an economic powerhouse was demolished. You know, like something like 80% of the farms in the Soviet Union went bankrupt. You know, in the former Soviet Union. You know, factories closed their doors, just one after another. You had, you know, mass shutting down of industry, and Russia was like not producing steel, not producing titanium, not producing things. And all of a sudden, you know, you had, you know, the rate of poverty in the country just skyrocket. The rate of extreme poverty skyrocket. You know, during that time, around any subway stop in any major city in Russia, there'd be a crowd of elderly people trying to sell you their clothes so they could eat. Okay, that's how bad it was. You know, I mean, organized crime came in, mass organized crime. You know, heroin was just, you know, just flowed into the country like you wouldn't believe.
That started the HIV epidemic, if I recall correctly, right?
It was a nightmare. The fall of the Soviet Union was a public health crisis. And, you know, I believe during that time, the population of Russia actually decreased by about 10%. Now, not all of those people died. A lot of them just left the country. There was a lot of people who just left, who just got out of there. But the population of the country overall went down by roughly 10%. U.S. economist Anders Gunter Frank called it economic genocide, is the term that was used, because it was Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. And he was advising Boris Yeltsin in how to basically rip the Russian economy apart and privatize everything. And the IMF and the World Bank, and they were there, and they were ripping the Russian economy to pieces and destroying the country. You know, there's a guy who's now all over U.S. media as an expert on how bad, you know, Putin is. His name is Bill Browder, and he was there with Hermitage Capital Management and British Petroleum. And he was there, you know, scamming the country and ripping the people off, and you know, and he was there, you know, and engaging in helping. And there were a lot of different American corporations and banks that were over there just ripping people off and just looting the country. It was a nightmare. Putin fixed it, and the way Putin fixed it was that he nationalized the oil and gas. He put oil and gas under state control. He created two state-controlled energy corporations. He called them national champions, Gazprom and Rosneft, and now basically the Russian economy is centered around these two giant state-controlled energy corporations. They sell oil and gas all over the world, and the proceeds go into the public budget, and the public budget is then used to subsidize all kinds of things. Russia just recently had the biggest farming boom of any country in the world. You know, they're growing wheat and crops in Russia like they never have before, because with that oil money, the Putin government has subsidized an agricultural boom. You know, Russia has seen a really big improvement in public housing and in many areas. The healthcare system is way better than it was during the 1990s, mainly because Putin reasserted a level of state control by using these two giant energy corporations to stabilize the economy. And that's really what you need to know. And that they tried free market capitalism. People always say, oh, communism failed. They tried it in the Soviet Union. Well, in the 90s, they tried free market capitalism in the Soviet Union. And it was an utter nightmare, you know, and it was a disaster. And the way they were able to end the nightmare of free market neoliberalism was by reasserting state control. And actually, Putin studied Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese political model a lot. You know, the current Russian political economic system is largely modeled on Deng Xiaoping in China in a lot of ways.
Also,
yeah. That next question was about Dugin then. All right. So Dugin is a political thinker in Russia. He was a founding member of the Russian Communist Party after the fall of the Soviet Union. He broke away from the Russian Communist Party and formed something called the National Bolshevik Party. And then he actually had a disagreement with the National Bolshevik Party, and now he runs something called the Eurasian Movement. He is not a Marxist or a leftist anymore. He's a traditionalist conservative. He calls himself a Eurasianist, and I don't agree with him largely. I'm a leftist. I believe in historical progress. That's essential to my viewpoint. I believe history is marching forward. He rejects that notion. He believes that there is some kind of traditional, Russian way that defines the Russian people. I don't view the world in those kind of terms. At this point, he's very right-wing and conservative. There's a book that he wrote called The Fourth Political Theory that I learned a lot from. And it's very insightful. It's a book, and it basically argues that that there are three existing political theories. That the first political theory is liberal democracy. The second political theory, which was intended to address the problems of liberal democracy, was communism, and then it had its flaws or whatever. So then fascism is the third political theory that was an attempt to correct the problems of liberal democracy, and it also had its problems. And he argued that around the world, something that he calls the fourth political theory is developing. And this fourth political theory, combines the strengths of both fascism and communism and could possibly defeat liberal democracy. That's his argument, okay? And it's not so much that he's arguing in favor of this fourth political theory. It's rather an observation that, China in a lot of ways, there are, while it is a Marxist system, there are aspects of China that do seem a little bit conservative and right-wing. The Islamic Revolution of Iran and Bolivarianism in Latin America, there are right-wing elements in some of these anti-imperialist movements, and that in a lot of ways, the rejection of liberalism in the 21st century, it's in a lot of ways the rejection of Western capitalism, I should say. It is left-wing in an economic sense, but a lot of times it's also right-wing in a social sense. It's socially conservative, left-wing economically, and that is kind of how working class people in the third world who are anti-imperialist, they tend to be socially conservative and economically left-wing, and that is kind of the political view of people around the world that are anti-imperialist. And that's largely correct. If you go to Iran, if you go to Venezuela, if you go to Cuba, you go to China now, those folks are, I would argue, more socially conservative in a lot of ways than Americans are, but far to the left of Americans in terms of economics. And it's an observation. And Dugin makes some very interesting points in that book. Dugin is one of the most important political theorists in our time. And that's just a fact. I mean, I'm sorry, but his ideas in Russia are very influential in, he's on Chinese television. They're influential in Iran. They're influential in Latin America. He is an important political theorist. And just because I had the opportunity to meet somebody who is very important and sit down next to one of the most well-known political theorists in the anti-imperialist world does not mean I endorse all of his ideas and does not make me responsible for every person he's ever shaken hands with, okay? I am not a Duginist. I vehemently disagree with him on many points, but I recognize that he is an important anti-imperialist voice. And, I don't just recognize that he's an important anti-imperialist voice. I also recognize that Minister Louis Farrakhan is also a very important anti-imperialist voice, probably one of the most important black leaders in the United States. In Iran, the Islamic Revolution of Iran is very conservative and Islamic and all that, but that it's a very important anti-imperialist country. Lenin shook hands with the Emir of Afghanistan. Did you know this? They had the Congress of the Peoples of the East right after the Russian Revolution. And Lenin invited every monarch, every autocrat. He said, if you are fighting the British and the American imperialists, the Soviet Union, we're going to be your friends. And that's what a real anti-imperialist is. If you are really an anti-imperialist, if you're really an anti-capitalist in our time, you have to be willing to sit down with people like Dugin or people like the Islamic Revolution of Iran or people like any force around the world that is legitimately anti-imperialist, fighting for the national liberation of its people. You have to be able to relate to it in some way. Dugin is a Russian who is fighting for his people against American imperialism. So I'm not ashamed to have sat down with him and been friendly with him. And I would do the same with black nationalists in America. I do the same with African anti-imperialists, Middle Eastern folks, that imperialism is the main danger to all humanity, right? And so if you're a legit anti-imperialist in our time, you should be able to have a conversation with other anti-imperialists.
Sure thing, yeah. And I was going to say, one of the main criticisms I've seen of Dugin in terms of like this sort of thing is they'll claim that he's not actually anti-imperialist. They'll say that he is pro-imperialist. He's just anti-American imperialism specifically, in that he will tactically support things like Russian or Latin American or Chinese imperialism if he believes it's going to accelerate the downfall of the U.S. empire. But I'm going to ask you two questions here, and then I'm going to let Rancho ask any questions he has. But since you're talking about the Ayatollah, I believe I could be wrong, but I think you've met the Ayatollah. So since that's the case, what was he?
Bit of an exaggeration. But
Oh, you didn't meet him? Oh, my bad. Oh,
I mean, I've been in the same room as the supreme leader of Iran. Yes, I didn't actually get to talk to him.
Gotcha. I didn't know that. Could you explain to the audience kind of just what was it like, being in the same room with him? What were some cool things you noticed about that? And then afterwards, after that question's done, can you, for my audience, since a lot of them don't understand this, can you explain like Latin American liberation theology to them?
Okay. Well, first, okay, so I'm going to give you three things. First, I'm going to respond to the point you made about Dugin there, first of all, because there's an important point that needs to be made. Then we'll talk about Iran. Then we'll talk about liberation theology.
Sure thing.
So as far as Dugin, Dugin, in a lot of his writings, he does talk about a Russian empire. Okay. And there's a lot of Orthodox Russians who talk about a Russian empire. But that's not the Marxist understanding of imperialism, right? They're talking about how, Ivan the Terrible and many of the czars that were around like thousands of years ago unified that whole area, right? The whole territories of Russia and the Russian Empire, and that benefited economically that whole area by unifying the peoples of those regions, right? In feudal times, right? It's similar to how in China there's a lot of admiration for the dynasties that brought together all of China, right? And that when, Orthodox, religious Russians talk about a Russian empire, what they mean is that by having all of the countries of like the former Soviet Union unified into a single government, not fighting against each other and economically cooperating with each other, that benefits everybody. And they're thinking like back in like feudal times, how like when there was one czarist empire, there was like an economic benefit before the rise of capitalism and Western colonialism and stuff like that, right? Imperialism in the Marxist sense refers to the rule of monopoly capitalism holding back development around the world, okay? So we have to differentiate those two things, right? That these are different concepts, right? And I hope that makes sense. But one is, imperialism, as I understand it, is an economic system where Western banks and corporations dominate the world. The way deeply conservative religious Russians view it, the empire is this religious entity that unified the peoples of the region. Okay?
So I believe there's like different types of empires, and some are more exploitative than others. Basically.
Right. I mean, in China, there's a huge amount of admiration for some of these dynasties. These feudal monarchs who unified all of China, and it was great. They unified the whole place, and it's a different kind of thing. Go see during World War II, the Soviet Union made a movie called Ivan the Terrible. And it's about how Ivan the Terrible was this great leader because he unified all the area. He created Russia as a country by defeating these different local monarchs and making one region. And that's, for the peoples of Eurasia, not having every little principality and region be independent and competing and fighting with other regions has been a very important thing in order to bring about economic development. So,
and NATO's trying to take off like the Ukraine and other neighboring states. They're trying to separate these places that are on the edges of Russia in the same way that I would argue, and Rancho would argue as well, that a lot of the American intellectual elites helped influence people that tried to break off from New Spain, the Criollo elites at the time, if that makes sense.
Sure. And so that's it's a little bit different, but there's been a lot of people who gotcha. It's like, you said Dugin's an anti-imperialist. Aha. Well, here he says the Russian Empire, blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's not, we're talking about, apples and oranges here. So I just wanted to make that point. Now, as far as Iran, so I went on a ship to Yemen, a ship to try and bring humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen with the Red Crescent Society, which is a UN recognized, it's the Red Cross, basically. In the Muslim world, they call it the Red Crescent Society. The Red Crescent Society, we tried to bring aid to Yemen. We were unable to dock our ship because the Saudis blew up the port the day we were supposed to arrive. They bombed the port 8 times in a single day. They killed a number of dock workers. 2 days after we were supposed to arrive, they blew up the medical university in Hodeidah. And they murdered a bunch of medical students, and it was basically sending the message, you're not allowed to get medical assistance from Iran. Our ship had medical supplies, flour, medicine, doctors, surgeons who were there to do operating, and they were trying to bring aid to the people of Yemen, and the Saudis wouldn't let the aid go through. That's a war crime, blocking humanitarian aid. So, we were, I went back to Iran. I got off the boat in Djibouti. I got in a plane and went back to Iran. When I got to Iran, I was in Iran for another month. I made a documentary film, I had the opportunity to come as a guest to the event that they had for the anniversary of the death of Imam Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Revolution. Right, the supreme leader of Iran is called Khamenei, but the founder of the Islamic Revolution, who died, is called Khomeini. At the mausoleum, this huge mausoleum of Khomeini, I was about 100 feet away from the supreme leader, the Grand Ayatollah Ali Syed Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution of Iran. That's an experience that very few Americans have ever had. And it was a life-changing experience. I am not the same person that I was as I walked into that mausoleum. I'm not the same person that I was when I walked out. It was a life-changing experience. I was in this mausoleum with 20,000 people. And when, he came out to the balcony, it was like the room shook. Okay. People started sobbing and crying. And it was a lot of very, very poor working class Iranians who saw him as their champion against the rich and powerful. And, every man in the audience extends their hands to him and says, "The blood in my veins belongs to the supreme leader," meaning I will die for you. And it's like, it was something. And I listened, I had a translator in, and I sat with the diplomats. We were all, I sat with diplomats from China and from African countries, and we sat there and we listened to him talk for an hour or so. And he gave a very important speech. And at one point in his speech, he talked about how in Iran there was a debate going on at the time about whether or not they should call America the Great Satan or not, because in Iran a lot of people call America Shaitan-i-Buzurg, which means the Great Satan. And the supreme leader said, yes, we do call America the Great Satan, but we don't refer to the American people. We refer to the American system and American imperialism, which is satanic and is against everything that God is about, and is contrary to even the Christian Bible and the things that the Americans believe in. And that, yes, while we love the American people and we support the Black people of America that are fighting for their rights, we do oppose, the American system. We do say that America is the Great Satan. And then I will never forget the moment that I was in a room of 20,000 people in this huge mausoleum of 20,000 people, who all then started chanting in unison at the top of their lungs, "Death to America, death to America, death to America." And that was an emotional experience for me, where tears started rolling down my cheeks. And it was like something I've never experienced before. And if you've never been through that and you've never been there, especially as a white American, that is something that really changed me as a person. Okay. And it really forced me to think about a lot of things. And I was in Iran for a couple of weeks after that, but I really did a lot of thinking about who I am and the kind of responsibility that I have as somebody living in the center of the empire. And, why it is that we can't LARP, and why this shouldn't be just a stupid childish game that we play. Okay. Why this isn't about dressing up like Che Guevara and trying to make yourself feel good. How we have a responsibility to actually take this seriously and actually win, because there are so many people around the world who are struggling. And America, our very name, has become synonymous with so much evil around the world. It was a very life-changing experience for me. And, it was a big moment, and I will never forget that. And I'm glad I had that opportunity. I feel very privileged that I had that opportunity to be in the same room as the supreme leader of Iran. I'm not a Shia Muslim. I don't agree with him on many points, but, he's an anti-imperialist, and I was in the same room, and it was a life-changing experience, and I don't regret it one bit. I expected that as soon as I got back to the airport to the United States, I would be arrested. I was prepared to be arrested. I told all my friends in the United States, I went on this ship to try and bring medical aid to Yemen. I met the supreme leader, and I think that when I get back to the United States, I'm going to be arrested. I was told by the Iranians that John Kerry actually, mentioned my name on a phone call with Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. He was quite angry that I was on that ship. And I expected that as soon as I got off the airport, I would be arrested immediately. Well, I wasn't. So, there you go. I wasn't arrested, and I continue to do my work as a journalist or whatever. So, as far as I'm concerned, I haven't broken any laws. I tried to deliver medical aid. I went to Iran and made a documentary. But, we know that the leaders of our system, again, that Carl Schmitt thing, the rule of law is not so much about the rule of law. It's about the rich and powerful choosing to go after people or not choosing to go after them. But so far, they haven't chosen to come after me, which is, a blessing. And so there you go. That's me. I'm here. I do my thing. I think the Iranians are anti-imperialists. I think that the Russians are anti-imperialists. I think the Chinese are anti-imperialists. And I want to support any anti-imperialist force in the world. And I think that the force that needs to become anti-imperialists ultimately, are the working people of this country, because imperialism is destroying their living standards. And we have more in common with the people around the world fighting for their national liberation than we do with the billionaires and bankers that have destroyed so many countries all over the world. So that's my answer about that. Now, as far as liberation theology, there are many different forms of Christian socialism. I think Christian socialism as a movement predates Marxism by a lot. There have been many different religious interpretations of socialism. Liberation theology is a particular brand of Christian socialism that emerged in Latin America during the 1960s. There were a lot of priests who were involved with struggles for social justice, that were critical of some of the military juntas that emerged during the Cold War during the 50s and 60s.
I was going to say real quickly, just to let you have a little nice breath of a break. I actually have a family member who was actually a priest in Chile under Pinochet, and he was actually forced into exile. He wasn't from Chile, but I know exactly what you mean. Like, there was a lot of members of the clergy who kind of saw, like, these juntas that were very right wing, and they wanted to voice their opinion and say that this was wrong, and that the church has an obligation to fight for economic justice. But I'll let you keep going. I just want to give you a tiny little water break.
Yeah. The what do you call it? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit okay. So all right, liberation theology. The Catholic Church does officially oppose capitalism, right? And they have, officially for a long time, right? I mean, they argue that capitalism puts money above religious principles. The Catholic Church is against both capitalism and Marxism. They are for a Christian economy where, people are cared for, et cetera. There's a long-standing Roman Catholic critique of capitalism that goes back, to the Middle Ages, really, right? But liberation theology was a religious current among priests in Latin America who were influenced by Marxism largely, right? They were influenced by Marxism, and as Christians, they were sympathetic to Marxism, and they found a way to combine Roman Catholic teachings with like Marxist concepts like class struggle, etc. That's what liberation theology is, and it was very influential in Nicaragua. And you could argue it's the ruling ideology of Nicaragua in a lot of ways now. But it's been very influential in Venezuela and in Bolivarian socialism elsewhere. Hugo Chavez and Maduro were both Roman Catholic. Evo Morales, is Roman Catholic, but also practiced some indigenous, pagan stuff. Did some ceremonies around that, and that.
Protestants claim that Catholicism's inherently pagan anyway, on top of that.
So there you go.
I was going to ask Caleb real quickly on, you can continue, but what denomination are you spiritually, Christian-wise?
So I grew up, I was baptized and then confirmed. I was baptized as a baby, but then confirmed into the United Church of Christ, which is a congregational Protestant church, right? A mainline Protestant church. That's what I grew up in, and when I became a communist atheist, I was a communist atheist for most of my early 20s. And it was really in Iran that I started to rediscover my faith in Jesus Christ and my Christianity. So I would call myself a Protestant. I am not a member of any denomination at this time. My wife, who is from Guatemala, is a Roman Catholic, and and her mother is very, very religious and Roman Catholic. And I have explored different Protestant traditions. That's one thing I'm very excited about doing post-pandemic here in New York City, is that I'm in New York City. There are many, many different churches here. And once the pandemic restrictions are lifted, I have actually a list of like 25 different churches I am going to attend their services on Sunday morning. So I'm going to make a church tour and figure out where I'll start attending post pandemic. But yeah, I grew up as a congregational Protestant, and I am now Protestant. I know I'm Protestant. I don't agree with Catholicism. As much as my wife and her family, they're Catholic and I love them. I don't think I could accept leadership from the Vatican, and there are other Catholic principles I don't agree with. I'm very much a Protestant in my outlook.
Okay, fair enough. And then, yeah, Rancho, what questions did you have for Caleb to build upon anything that we've said here, or just something new in general?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. Earlier, you touched on, Caleb, about very briefly, kind of like the working class is disappearing because there's no longer a need for them. So I wanted to kind of get your take on automation and, in a sense, the future of the working class, because I thought that was very interesting how technology is basically making the working class obsolete. How do you think people should deal with that?
Well, it's interesting because, there's a lot of writing about this. Like there's this whole concept of the precariat and the new class and such. But if you really dig into this stuff, this is exactly what Karl Marx said would happen, right? If you read the volumes of Capital, not just Capital Volume 1, but Capital Volume 2, 3, and 4, this is what Marx said would happen. That as the capitalists advance technology, the role of the worker in production would get smaller and smaller and smaller because the capitalist is trying to maximize his profit, right? And the fewer people he hires, the more money he gets. However, as Marx pointed out, that machines do not create surplus value. Only workers do, right? So at the end of the day, the smaller and smaller and smaller you make the role of the worker in production, the smaller the rate of profit the capitalist makes. You have a phenomenon called the falling rate of profits, where the percentage that the capitalist is able to make in profit for item that he sells is lower the fewer people he hires. And the falling rate of profit leads to an economic crisis. And there's, the classic glut of overproduction where, the capitalist is churning out so many goods, but at the end of the day, no one can afford to buy them. This is the classic problem that Marx talked about, and that eventually you will have a layer of people that are desperately poor and unemployed, and you'll have so few people involved in the process of production that it will become necessary, just in order for the broad people, all the people who've been kicked out and no longer have a place at the assembly line, it will be necessary for society as a whole to seize the means of production. This is just Marxism 101. This is basic Marxism, that the process of the capitalist advancing technology will ultimately result in the necessity of the means of production becoming public property and being rationally organized. That's Marxism. And you can talk about the precariat, and you can talk about, the low wage economy, and you can talk about automation. But at the end of the day, this is just capitalism working the way capitalism works. Go read Capital. I really enjoy a book by Nelson Puri called The Future is Up to Us, which is about the question of automation. As much as I'm not a fan of Fred Goldstein, he did write a very good book called Low Wage Capitalism. This is the process. This is what Marx wrote about for years, and this is automation, and it is making socialism a necessity. And socialism is not worker cooperatives. Socialism is not individual companies that have a profit, but the profit is shared. Socialism is a centrally planned economy.
Very well put, Caleb. I like that answer. And Marcus, can you please ask Caleb your question that you have here?
Sure. Caleb, do you think that going forward, as capitalism faces a bigger and bigger crisis, do you think it'll be able to try and save itself, or like it did with, say, the New Deal, where it almost made like a nationwide Potemkin village from, say, the mid-30s until the early 1980s, when the labor unions started to fall apart, outsourcing became a thing, when it no longer had to compete against a Marxist-Leninist society in the Soviet Union. It could just take the mask off and show itself for what it actually is. Do you think capitalism will try that again with, say, universal basic income, finally giving universal health care to Americans, things along that
Infrastructure
line.
programs, yeah, all that stuff to compete with China and Russia.
Well, it's important to point out that just like Hitler and the Nazi state temporarily stabilized the German economy, the New Deal was also temporary. The USA did not economically boom until after the war. The New Deal temporarily stabilized the US capitalist economy, and it built a lot of the infrastructure that helped the US economy to boom after the war. But there was a lot of economic problems, and as the I mean, from the time of 1935, you had the Works Progress Administration. You had an economic crisis in 1937. 1939, you had another downturn, and things were getting bad. And then World War II happened. It didn't fix the underlying problem of the capitalist economy. It was a mechanism to try and stabilize it. It solved the issue of unemployment, in a lot of ways. It stabilized some industrial output, but at the end of the day, it didn't solve the underlying problem. The Great Depression was caused by the assembly line. It was caused by Henry Ford and the advances in production that had been developed. And the way the Great Depression of the 1930s was resolved was by blowing up every major city in the Western world, outside of the United States, right? All of Europe, all of Japan. You have a war, millions of people die, they all get blown up and killed. Then after that war, all those countries don't have industries anymore, so they have to buy all their products from the United States. And yes, coming out of World War II, suddenly the USA had a booming economy because the rest of the world was buying all its products from the one country that didn't get blown up in the war. And on top of that, there'd been so much destruction that they could only rebuild. And so you had a booming U.S. economy. And, in Nazi Germany, the Nazis, yes, for the first 2 or 3 years of the Nazi state, they did have a big economic boom. But the reason they ultimately had World War II was because the Nazis' mechanisms, trying to stabilize the U.S. economy, or the German economy, again, they worked for 2 or 3 years and they created a really big boom because they did them in a very, very dramatic and forceful way, a much more forceful and dramatic than the New Deal in the United States. It was really, really dramatic. But at the same time, it didn't stabilize things. And the reason that the Nazis were forced to, engage in their expansionism and all of that is because their economy was starting to slow down again. So at the end of the day, the only way that we could really get out of the capitalist crisis we're in, because the computer revolution is far, far more devastating in terms of unemployment and falling rate of profit than Henry Ford, what Henry Ford did. I'm sorry. I mean, we got 3D printers now. We're on the brink of self-driving cars now, okay? So really, other than having a socialist revolution, and actually centrally planning the economy, really, I mean, they can give universal basic income, they can do some infrastructure programs, they can do this, they can do that. First of all, it's going to be hard to do it because in order to do measures like that, in order to do the big measures that would be necessary to stabilize it, there's got to be some Bonapartism because there's going to be sections of the ruling class that are going to fight that like hell, right? And so one section of the capitalist class is going to have to really demolish another section of the capitalist class to make it happen, right? You have to remember that, right? And, I mean, look what happened on January 6th, right? If you're going to pass universal basic income, if you're going to really rebuild America's infrastructure, one section of the ruling class that's for that has got to push back a lot of power from the other faction. I mean, there's got to be some real Bonapartism. I mean, I would think that a president who really took dramatic measures to try and stabilize this crisis would probably have to put a few of his political rivals in prison at minimum. Okay, there would have to be some arrests. There would have to be some military stuff that would go on. You would have to have a much higher level of authoritarianism within the capitalist class itself in order to make that happen, because the rest of the capitalist class would fight against it. But on top of that, it still wouldn't solve the underlying problem. The problem that people don't have a place in the means of production. If we give everyone $1,000 a month, that doesn't change, right? It changes when you no longer have an economy that's organized for profit. That's when it changes. And that's really the only way out of this crisis.
Very good answer, Caleb. And I just want to let the audience know that we are actually wrapping up here. So we're going to be, we'll have Angelo asking one of his questions since he hasn't really said anything on here. Then we'll do the super chat questions and then we will be done and out. And Caleb, thanks so much already for the content you're providing here.
Sure. My voice is giving out. It's allergy season here and it's getting late, but yeah, we'll do it and then we'll be done. So there you go. Very good.
All right, Angelo, ask your question, please.
Hey Caleb, what's up? Been a big fan of yours for a while, and you said that you're a Christian, and I'm a Christian as well. But what I noticed here in America, and especially the left here, is that especially modernly, religious people are kind of excluded from leftist thought because sadly, capitalists and rightists have the copyright on Jesus. And I was wondering, how do we get more religious people to support our way of economic thought? Because most religious people I talk to get turned off by leftist economics because they fell for like the CIA propaganda.
Well, there's a couple things. The first thing that I think needs to be done is that we need to stop giving priority to the culture wars. The socialist movement needs to say, you know what? If you are somebody who feels abortion should be illegal, I personally think abortion should be legal. If you're somebody who thinks that gay marriage is not okay, I have no problem with gay marriage, but you're welcome in our movement. And that's the Center for Political Innovation. If you're against gay marriage, you can join the Center for Political Innovation. If you're against abortion, you can join the Center for Political Innovation. I am done waging a culture war against people, right? And you can hold on to your religious and cultural beliefs as long as you believe in socialism. That's what I want to talk about, is socialism. I'm not interested in waging a culture war against middle America. That's the first thing that needs to be said. The next thing that needs to be said is that, we need to push back, right? I'm sorry, but I've come across there's so much libertarian propaganda that is directed at Christians to try and convince Christians that somehow, the satanic teachings of Ayn Rand are in line with the Bible. They are not. And it is the most shallow. I read these screeds. There's a book like The Biblical Guide to Economics. It's one of these right-wing screeds. You read this crap. It is the most shallow stuff. Like they'll take, at the Last Supper, Mary Magdalene, pours, some perfume on Jesus's feet, and the disciples say, "Oh, couldn't you have given that money to the poor?" And Jesus says, "Well, there will be poor always, but I will not always be there." They're like, "Aha! He said there will be poor always, so therefore, communists who want to get rid of poverty are wrong. We got them." And it's like, come on. It's the most shallow. They'll take you reap what you sow and say, see, you reap what you sow. So taxation is theft because you reaped it, so you should sow it. Aha! It's like the most shallow, stupid conservative cliche. It's like, Jesus is talking about the last shall be first and the first shall be last. He's calling on his followers to fight for a whole new world. It's like you read Jesus's teachings and what they actually taught, not these little stupid cliches. And it's very, very clear that free market neoliberalism is completely inconsistent with everything that Jesus stood for. Jesus was a champion of the working people. He was a carpenter. Christianity as a religion really got strong in Rome as an expression of the proletariat and their aspirations in Roman society. Now the other thing I wanted to mention is that the problem is this. This is really the problem, okay? Is that I noticed right after Trump got elected, in the Wall Street Journal and in a number of publications, the New York Times and all of that, they ran these stupid gimmickal stories about the religious left's day has come. The religious left is rising. And they would do these silly interviews here's a hipster church in Brooklyn and they all went to a Black Lives Matter rally. Yay. And here's a hipster church in Chicago and they just went and wrote letters to Bernie Sanders or something. Yeah, and it's like, and it was like the ruling class of the United States, because they see the religious right and Trump, and they were trying to fight Trump. They were trying their hardest to create a religious left, but it didn't work. It was so fake and phony. It didn't work. And the reason it didn't work, and I'm sorry, as somebody I went to some of these religious left churches and listened to what they had to say, it was all fake. It was foundation money. It was the Ford Foundation. It was George Soros and the Rockefeller folks. And it was like fake. It was the most fake, I don't know how to put this into words, but it was not sincere, right? Religion is about emotions. Religion is about passion and dedication. People who are reading a script to get their foundation money don't want to do that. A real religious left in the United States would be John Brown, right? Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, that's religious left. Okay, Minister Farrakhan, that's religious left. I mean, you could talk about some of the Catholic priests, Father Roy Bourgeois and some of these Catholic priests. I mean, there is a religious left in the United States. Those people are radicals, right? They're fanatics. Those are people that would die for their beliefs. Those are people that would make great sacrifices. These are people that have a very explosive and revolutionary message. The ruling class is not going to give those folks foundation money to fight Donald Trump, okay? And that's the problem, is that there are real fanatical religious people that are anti-capitalist and left-wing. That's not who George Soros paid for his fake religious left. And that's why it fell on its face.
Wow. Great answer, Caleb. So now we are done with this. Let's do the super chat questions and we're out of here. I mean, I don't think we have a lot of super chats. I think we only got 2 right now. So this one is by Blue Division. It says here, I would like to know if Caleb is willing to have a follow-up with Culture Thug. It didn't seem like Caleb gave him a fair shot and kind of hid behind quote-unquote more violent fascism, which is just silly coming from a so-called communist. Do not allow white nationalists to hijack the third position. Could we get a real and genuine discussion and follow up to see where tankies and ideological fascists can meet and make compromises?
Maybe. It depends on the circumstances. Didn't he take his channel down or something?
I'm not sure. I know that recently he's kind of been about this thing where he's sort of promoting American fascism that doesn't really focus on race because he kind of just views that as really dumb. But other than that, I'm not quite sure what he's up to. I think he moved the BitChute. But
okay.
Yeah, would you say that's your final answer, Caleb? And then we can move on to the next one?
To it. That's my answer. Okay.
Awesome. Next question here is by Union Ibero-Americana. It says here, how do we promote anti-capitalism in Ibero-America, bros? So I guess he's kind of just asking you, what would you suggest in order to promote it down there?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Sure. So he basically asks, what's an effective way that we can help promote anti-capitalism in Latin America?
Well, I think that largely that direction needs to come from the Sandinistas. It needs to come from the Bolivarians. I would study what they've accomplished and learn from their successes, learn from what they've summed up, from the failures, learn from what's going on in Peru right now. I would study the traditions more recently throughout the region and what they've learned. That's awesome. Let me just check to see if we have any more. And if not, yeah, it looks like we're done. So I'm going to actually just end it right here. Great stuff, guys. Good. All right. Well, have a good night. And thanks for having me on. Thanks, Caleb. We covered a lot of
Caleb.
material. My pleasure. Talk to you all soon.
Goodbye.